In the wrong river, but we're doing all right. I want to welcome you to the 2018 Haley Memorial Library and History Center Fall Gathering. This is the 19th year that we've done the Proctor Award, but we've been doing the ranch storytelling for about 22 years now. What this does, it captures the stories of the families that have maintained the ranges of the Southwest. Southwestern Texas and southeastern New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and now we're branching up into Oklahoma and what's that other state up there? Anyway, I've been telling people for years they're watching the wrong river, but we're doing all right. We'll manage. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Pat McDaniel, and I've had the very good fortune to be the director of the library now for 24 years. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun, and we've had some problems, trials, like every organization does, but the support that we get from the local community and the outreach community of the ranching people from the Southwest has just been tremendous. All the records and all the interviews and all the manuscripts and all the photographs that are in that building over there is your heritage. It all matters. It may not matter today, but it'll matter to your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. When they want to know where their people came from, they can go over there and find it for the most part. And that's what these stories do. We're able to capture them on video now. We didn't have that to start with. We just had audio. But it's a great thing to go back, for me to go back and look at these stories that get told up here 5 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, it's wonderful. And we've got it now where we can put it on the website. And that's the next step for us, is to get all these videos on the website indexed where people can go find stories by Buster Welch. They can go find stories by Pete Bonds. They can go find stories by John Welch and Ken Welch. You ought to get those two up here together, and I hope I can later, because you ought to hear some stories talking about what their exploits were when they were in trouble most of the time. I want to welcome today the trustees of the library that are here that keep me solvent. Brian McLaughlin, the chairman of the board, is not here today, but Jeff Haley is. Jeff is the grandson of J. Evans Haley, who lives in Gray County, Texas, up at LaForce, McLean area. Jeff, would you stand up? Joe Sullivan and Bill Caruth are here, and Robert Carr Vincent. They're all trustees. I've probably got the best job in the nonprofit world in West Texas. I've only got 5 trustees, and they either got to die or resign. And so far, I've got the same ones I started with 23 years ago. So that's pretty awesome. So thank you. We've got honorees, recipients of the Fort Proctor Memorial Award that are here with us. Buster Welch is here today, which is an amazing feat in itself. I think they saw him running down the highway with a pink bunny suit on and beating a drum. We're glad you're here, Buster. John will be here in a few minutes, and Ken should be here. Ralph Miller's here. Stand up, Ralph. Yeah, where is Ralph? He's back there. Pete Bonds is up here on the stage. We'll have, and Candy Cowden will be here for the second set. So thank you all for coming. Beg your pardon? Who? Bob Kelton. Where are you? He doesn't ever say anything. That's his problem. He tells some good stories, but he hadn't had time to think about them. Maybe he will in the next few minutes. One year, we got Bob up here to tell us about the lineage of the Keltons in West Texas. And he did such a good job with that one set of stories that it straightened everybody out on all the Keltons and where they came from, when they were here, and where they went. And that was an amazing thing to get captured for posterity. Because believe me, there's a bunch of Keltons. Today, Our master of ceremonies is Terry Jordan, and he's going to moderate these sessions, these panels. Terry was raised in Seymour, Texas, and resides now in Greenwood with his wife of 42 years, Susan. Terry started his rodeo career at a young age as a rodeo clown and bullfighter, but he figured out, like most smart people do, that the announcers made just as much money and lived a lot longer. He joined the PRCA as a professional rodeo announcer and worked the national finals for 7 years doing stats and interviews. He recently completed an award-winning television show on RFD TV titled Stock Show Confidential. I don't know whether y'all remember seeing that on RFD. He's currently employed with Montana Silversmiths as a territory rep and consultant. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Terry Jordan.
Thank you, Pat. How's everybody doing on a Saturday afternoon? Wasn't that rain great? I tell you, we needed that out here in West Texas really bad, and I know they needed it down y'all's way, down in Fort Davis area. So we were glad to have that. We're glad to have all of you here, and it's going to be a nice afternoon for all of you. So if you haven't met everybody today, make sure that you do that before you leave, because that's the way we make lifelong friends out here in West Texas. And, you know, these guys up here, it's certainly an honor and a privilege to be able to share the stage with them and listen to some of the stories that they tell. And I don't guess a cowboy gathering would ever be complete with a little bit of cowboy poetry. And I had the opportunity to do one last year that was titled to Haley, and Pat was kind enough to allow me to do one more for you this year. So with your permission, here it goes. If I take off my hat and say yes, ma'am, if I give up my chair and say I'll stand, well, I'm just being a cowboy. But you know, there's something that's been bothering me, and it's not that hard to understand. But you know the difference between a football and a rodeo fan is every time they play the national anthem, we'll always stand. But if you ever do see us take a knee, we're talking to the Lord. That's the way it ought to be. So we're here today to honor two men. We've done it before, and we'll do it again. We'll talk about their accomplishments, their hopes, their dreams, their family, their friends. What they've done, it's a noble cause. So won't you join with me as we welcome them with a Haley Library, Foy Proctor, Cowman's applause. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. You know, my dad always told me, he said, to be a good speaker, keep it short, keep it sweet, and keep it and sit down. So I'm going to do that this time. I'm going to turn it over. Warren, let's go to you first. And I happened to hear a few stories early on, but I'm going to give you the microphone, and I'm going to let you tell a couple, and then we're going to come back and touch on a couple of things here in a minute. What do you got?
Well, am I on here? Okay. I was one of 6 kids. There's 4 boys and 2 girls, and there was 7.5 years between the oldest and youngest, so we was pretty close together. And when I announced, or I guess Leslie announced that I had won this award, Randy, who was my brother here, he said, "Bull, we've been punching cows for a combined 110 years. And I thought he just pulled that out of the blue. And so I was driving home, and I got to thinking the math in my head, and I divided that in 2 and subtracted the ages, and that made us 9 and 6. And I said, well, that's about right. That we probably started punching cows about that age, and so we've been going at it for 55 years, and I don't know if we can make the next 55, but we'll sure work on another 20 probably. And anyway, just growing up on the ranch there with brothers and sisters that we were that close to, we was always doing something, horseback or doing something together. And we never had a TV till I was in college, so we was outside the whole time, and it was pretty special growing up with brothers and sisters that was that close in age. But once I got my driver's license, I'll probably be referencing Jiggs Porter a lot. He was the cow foreman over at the Crow Creek division of the ranch, and it's been said that my mother gave birth to us, but the 4 boys were raised by Jiggs Porter, and he's the one that taught us the cowboy, and if we really knew when we made a mistake. I mean, you didn't make the same mistake twice around jigs. He'd air you out pretty good, and we weren't he didn't show any favor towards us versus the hands. We all got a butt chewing if we needed it, but anyway, once I got my driver's license when I was 15, we spent most of the summers over at Crow Creek. Jiggs's boy was in between Randy and I age-wise, so the three of us were pretty close, and once we got to where we'd ride and make a hand, we didn't have trailers back then. We didn't get a gooseneck trailer at Crow Creek till 1980, and so we had a bobtail truck. That was our means of getting the horses around, and you couldn't just unload it anywhere. You'd back down into the bar ditch or the road or a dirt bank someplace and jump those horses out, and they were amazing in themselves. It would probably be a couple foot down the jump that they'd have to jump out, and the trick was if we ever had to load them back, you got your horse on first, or so the last horse, he'd have to jump and be turning at the same time to fit in that back gate. And so anyway, some of the fun times going we'd move the cattle from the headquarters part of the ranch up to the mountains, and we'd have 2 herds of 500 going each time, and the older cows, boy, they know what was up. They'd be getting to the gate before, they'd be there all night ready to go, and first daylight was at 4 o'clock, and we'd be up at 1:30 in the morning getting breakfast and getting organized. But we'd push those cows across there, and it'd take us, we'd have to go across the UU Bar Ranch, the Philmont Ranch, to the foot of the mountains, and we'd pair the cattle up there, and they'd be strung out probably a mile and a half. The old cows in the lead that knew where they were going, they'd have their calf and be going on, and we'd have the young cows in the back. And so anyway, us boys would be there, and we'd put after we paired them up that afternoon, we'd put them into the drive, and they'd go up on their own mostly, and then on their own. But the young ones, again, they didn't know the route, so we'd take them up, and we'd get up on top with them about 10 that morning and ride back down to camp, and Jiggs would say, well, you boys are young and strong. Why don't you drink water and trot these horses back to the headquarters, which was probably 20 miles. And so we'd get us a drink, and off we'd go. And it seemed like we was always trotting someplace. I mean, I don't think we got a horse on the place now that could trot over a half mile, but back then, trotting 10 or 15 miles didn't seem like much, and we'd get going. And so anyway, Randy and I and Hal, we drew the short straw, it seemed like, every time. And then going to brandings, we'd have to drive the horses from the headquarters, from Crow Creek over to the headquarters of Remuda, and that'd be a 20-mile trot. And then from the camp down there. So, I mean, we didn't know any different back then. We didn't have trailers, and that was just the only way we could do things. And looking back on it now, you just say, good night. Should have been an easier way, but that was the only way we knew at the time. And so, I don't know, we went through a lot of stuff, and as I grow older, once we had kids, we homeschooled our kids. And I remember one day, Walter was 4, and Mary and I and Walt were out gathering this pasture, and we told Walt, you head right towards that dirt mound over there, a half mile away, there's a dirt tank, and you take those cows there. And we each went out to the right and left and was gathering cattle into them. And when we got there to the dirt tank, there was Walt with his cows there, and he'd turned around in the saddle, was facing back, and was just leaned over, sound asleep on the horse's butt. And so our kids, they've been out since they were young, and I didn't find out till the later years when we were there at Dawson that they didn't like going to the iron bridge. We'd push cattle up past the iron bridge, and they'd break the gate down or the fence, and it seemed like we'd have to push them 4 or 5 times. And boy, those kids hated it, but they had snacks and all. Mary put snacks in their saddlebags, and gave them that, and so they were kind of satisfied. But it's been a good life growing up with brothers and sisters on the place, and then having our own kids kind of doing the same type of thing, and so it's been fun.
Before I forget, if any of you have friends that can't make it here, we are live streaming on the World Wide Web, and it's called livestream.com. So be sure and check that out and look for the Haley Library on livestream.com, and they can join us as well. Now, you were talking about family, and I happen to know a little story about you, and I don't think it was this brother. I think it was your other brother that you left out in the pasture one time. You want to tell me about that? Was that?
Who was it? Do you know that story?
No,
maybe I have selective memory. I don't know.
Yeah. I think they've tried to forget it. But,
Oh.
Like, what was that again? I couldn't.
I think
Did we leave somebody out in the
Warren
pasture?
went off and left one of y'all
What's
in the
that?
pasture one time.
Did we leave somebody in the pasture?
It could have been during a heated discussion or something that he'd probably trotted on back to camp, but I can't place which.
Tell me one thing about a horse that you had called Snakebite.
Boy, that was one of the best. I broke him as a 2-year-old, and it seemed like when I threw a saddle on him and got on him, he was broke. I don't know how that happened, and it hadn't happened again. But the second time I rode him, I just decided to put a piece of rope around his neck, and that was what I would use. Instead of a bridle, I used that, and he was better without a headstall than with one. And I remember one time we were gathering calves and cows, and the calves would start breaking back, and Sarah, I know she chased after some of the calves, and they weren't coming back, so I loped around them to help her, and he'd get after them and bite them every time. And so he was just after this little calf, and once he goes to biting, that calf, boy, he was looking for his mother and was headed back to the herd, and I wish I had more of horses like him. Seems like there's not many of them and a lot more of the other bramer-headed ones, I guess.
When we talk about good horses, the guy that's probably sat on as many good horses as anybody is the guy to your immediate right there.
I bet.
World champion NCHA cutting horse guy, Shannon Hall. Shannon, I'm going to turn the stage over to you and let you tell us something.
Well, thank you. This is an incredible honor, and while I was listening to Warren tell his stories, my mind and heart have been both going 1,000 miles an hour. I thought, who am I going to tell stories about up here? I've got some great stories on Dawson Burns and Frank Kelton, but we have ladies and children here today, so I can't tell them. And it seems like today that if you get a panel together, you have to tell stories on Brett Kavanaugh, but I don't have any of those. So I better stick to what I can remember best, and that story's on myself. I was raised up till I was about 11 by my beautiful mother, who's here today, Sandy. Y'all give her a hand. I'm proud of her. She raised me in the city to know city things, and so I'm very blessed to have seen both sides of life. When I was 11, I got the great privilege then to actually meet my father. This is my dad, Donnie Hall, right down here, the greatest cowboy I've ever met, right there. So Dad inherited me when I was 11 and instantly began to take a long-haired city boy and make a cowboy out of him. And I'm glad he's not on this stage because his stories might destroy everything they think of me as of this point. But I knew immediately I was connected to a horse. I loved a horse. I remember telling my older brother after we'd lived there a couple weeks, I'll ride a horse the rest of my life. And I've pretty much done that so far at 54. But one of my first examples of riding a horse was after we'd just been there a few weeks. Dad worked on the W.J. Lewis Estate Ranch and one of the larger ranches there in the panhandle of Texas. And we went to work cattle, and as Warren said, in those days, trailers were pretty much obsolete, except most ranches used them, but Dad refused to at his camp, so he made everybody continue to trot. And I had never ridden a horse, much less just in a little circle in the corral, but it was my first experience to trot 15 miles, Warren. And I had this horse that I learned on. Dad was teaching me to ride. His name was Pet, and he trotted like a jackhammer. And we left there that morning in the dark, and I don't know how far we trotted, but I finally got up there close to where Dad was, and I said, "Sir, I need to ask you something. I think I want to go back." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, it's no closer going back than going the direction we're headed," something like that. So we continued to trot. So we trotted however far we did, and then we scattered out and gathered that pasture. And you'd have thought by the time I got home that day, my horse experiences were done for. But I wasn't. I knew I was going to continue to ride a horse. Not long after that, I wanted to attempt breaking my first horse. My first attempt at that was a gray horse. His name was Headlight. And Dad didn't have a bronc pen. We just had a big square pen, and we'd tie their leg up and saddle them and waller them around a little bit, and then you'd get on them and you'd ride them, and you hoped you got enough rode off of them before Dad swung the gate and said, "Oh, he's ready, let's go." And my first or second ride on old Headlight, he ran to the side of this little square pole corral, and he just jumped and went over. Well, as he was going over, I decided city boys had enough, and I stepped off and let him have it. And Dad was so disappointed. "Why did you step off?" And to the city boy, that looked like the best option at the time while he was going over that horse. My second attempt at breaking a horse was a black horse. His name, well, he had a good name, didn't he, Dad? I'll leave it at that. And I went, and he had gotten injured as a colt, and we doctored him, and so he had been handled a little bit. And I went to saddling him and getting ready to ride him. And the first day or two, I got, is that music playing for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like my kind of music,
Yeah.
Warren. So the first day or two, I saddled him. He seemed fine, and so I turned his foot loose and went to ride him. And boy, I mean, he bucked me off right now. Dad was at the house, and so I thought, well, I can't go to the house yet. So I tied his foot up and watered him around a little longer, and I got on this black horse, and he bucked me off again right now. I mean, no longer than I'd get to sit down, then he'd buck me off. And after about 3 trips of that, I thought, I need help. So I walked to the house and I said, "Dad, I can't ride this black horse." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "He bucks me off." So Dad, he goes down there, and my dad was pretty forked in the day. And he's going to show me, so without adjusting any hardware on the saddle, he stepped up there and he commenced to make him move out. And he bucked him off right now. And he looked at me and smiled real big, and he said, "Say, he can buck a little, can't he?" I said, "I thought so." So I thought I had a chance as a cowboy, because if he could buck him off, I had a little chance anyway. But you're right, I have been blessed to get to ride some great horses. My life has been an adventure, just an absolute adventure every day. Such an honor, you know, to have my dad here, the cowboy that he is, to have men like Frank Kelton that worked for me that were a better cowboy than I ever thought I could be, to have my mentor Buster Welch here and all that he's taught me and the cowboy that he is. This is just a great time and a great gathering. And, you know, the stories that I thought about telling today were just such a blessing to experience. The ranch that Dad worked for was one of the few ranches probably in the state that continued to work a big roundup. When I was a kid and first moved there, they still ran several different brands. And they'd hold a roundup up of several hundred cattle, and they would mammy those calves up and sort them according to brand. And when they got them sorted, sent out to the cuts, then you'd drive that set of cuts to the pen and brand them. And so, of course, being the kid, my job was to sit just as far from the roundup as you could get and hold the cuts. But I watched from a distance, and I watched men like my dad and Johnny Hill and some of those men that I grew up under that were good cowboys work that roundup and work the roundup on good horses. And it just continued to build that passion I had within me that someday, somehow, I'm not only going to work that roundup, but I'm going to own a ranch of my own. And that was my passion, and I'm just incredibly blessed to get to achieve that.
The story I heard was that when you were younger, you started roping calves in high school and in college. What made you change over to the cutting horse industry? What was the biggest difference there, and what did you like about that better?
Lack of winning. It was pretty simple. When you weren't beating anybody riding broncs and roping, you needed a new event. Yeah. You know, the first cutting horse that I remember, Dad took me to Amarillo, the World Finals one year, and Buster showed Little Peppy. Is that not correct, Dad? And I watched him show Little Peppy that night and put on a display that I didn't even think was possible. The cattle were tough that night, and Buster walked in there, and he loped a cow up out of there and throwed his hand down, and old Little Peppy laid down and went to working back. You could see in the sand where he drug his front end working backwards. Dad and I sat right down there on the rail and watched. And then when he got close to that roundup, Buster said, "That's far enough." And he held that cow at bay right there. And I remember leaving there thinking, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen a horse do. I wanted to do that. And so that put a passion in me. I went from there, when I was about 15, I went to work for D.M. Coughlin. And he put me on a little horse called Chubby, and he had me work a roundup on Chubby. I was 15 years old. And when I started out working a roundup, I wanted to steer that horse. You know, I'd never ridden a horse that would really work a cow. So I started out steering that horse every time the cow would turn. And DM, Mr. Coughlin, he told me, he said, "Shannon," he said, "when you show that cow to old Chubby, turn your reins loose and let him have it." And my first thoughts were, well, what's he gonna do if I don't tell him to do it? But I got that first cow sorted, and I put my hand down, and old Chubby's head went low. And as that cow tried to work back, he ran and stopped and held her and would continue to push her till I got her pushed out to the cuts. And I thought, man, that's amazing. I must look just like that Buster guy did at that horse show.
I asked Buster Welch up here, I think it was about 2 years ago, if he remembered the best horse he ever sat on. And he said, yeah. And I said, you remember the worst horse you ever sat on? And he said, oh, yeah. No, I'm going to ask you the same question because I know you had a very special horse called Shania C.
Yes, I too been very blessed with some great horses. Shania C was an incredible horse for me, obviously, because I won the Futurity Honor, and she went on and won $400,000. What made her so incredible was she had a lack of physical ability, but she had a heart that was just unreal. When you got to the finals, she stepped up and she did some things physically that I knew was hard for her, and she didn't do when I practiced, and she didn't do when I worked her. But when you got in that environment and that atmosphere, she just lit up. The greatest horse I ever threw a leg over was actually a horse called Work Smooth. I started that horse for Mr. Jimmy Randall's in New Mexico, and kind of a good story, he sent me that horse in February. He was 3 years old, and he'd been ridden about 20 times, so he was relatively green in a training process. But I knew as soon as I started this horse is special. He started doing some things with a cow immediately on his own that he just wasn't supposed to know to do. And so I worked that horse through the summer, and I went to Mr. Randall's ranch in New Mexico. He lived at Montoya, New Mexico, and he wanted to see me work this horse. And the day I worked him, his cattle were pretty tough to work. So I kept kind of close contact. We called that horse Herman. And I kept close contact with Herman and had just a decent work. It was just decent. And Mr. Randall said, well, he looks pretty good, Shannon. And so, but I left there that day and drove to Mr. Coughlin's house. And we were going to work horses there the next day. Well, the cattle that day at Mr. Coughlin's were outstanding. It was just a good work. A horse could work and you could leave him alone. And so just in having fun working that day, I pulled the bridle off of Herman and worked him. Well, when I got done working him, Mr. Coughlin told me, he said, he and Jimmy Randall's grew up together. They were best of friends growing up. And Mr. Coughlin told me, he said, he said, I want to buy that horse. And I said, well, I believe Mr. Randall's wants to sell him. And he said, well, what does he want for him? And I said, well, I believe he wants $50,000 for him. And Billy said, well, I'm not going to give him $50,000. I said, well, that's between you and Mr. Randall's. And he said, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write you a check for $35,000. And he said, I want you to go home. Don't call Jimmy till you get home. When you get home, call Jimmy and say, Mr. Randall's, I've got a check for that horse if you want to sell him. But the owner doesn't want anybody to know that he's trying to buy a horse. So I drove home and I called Jimmy and I said, Mr. Randall's, I've got a check for $35,000 for old Herman if you want to sell him. And he was quiet for a little bit and he said, no, I want 50. I said, okay, but I've got a check in my hand for $35,000. He said, well, who's the check on? I said, well, this gentleman, remember, they're best of friends. He said, well, this gentleman didn't want me to disclose that he was looking for a horse, so if you didn't take his offer, he just didn't want it known. Well, I'll have to think about it, he says. And I said, all right. Well, he calls me back the next day, and he said, I'm going to sell that horse to that guy. Who is it? I said, well, it's Billy Coughlin. He said, y'all got to me. And I said, well, why do you think that? And he said, I know that's a better horse than that. And he kind of laughed. Well, that horse went on. Jim Coughlin and I showed it, and that horse went on and won 200-something thousand. But he matured in the greatest horse I ever rode. He could run and stop and think about a cow like no other I've ever been privileged to ride. But up until Mr. Randall's last days, every time he saw me or Billy Coughlin, he'd smile and say, y'all owe me more money on that bay horse. Yeah.
I didn't ask you about this, but you know, in our industry, it's a small industry, and everybody gets to be close friends. But I happen to know a story about you that a young man was in a fire, pretty bad fire, got burned up, and he had about 20 horses that he was training at that time, and you took those 20 horses from him, Shannon, and worked those horses for that guy, and never took a paycheck for that. The paycheck was sent to the young man. He was in the burn unit up in Lubbock, Texas. So I commend you for that, and I wish y'all would commend him as well. That really says something about horse people, of what we do for each other. So thank you.
Yes, sir.
Randy, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know you've got to have a good story about this guy sitting right here to my right.
Well, you know, this is indeed a great honor and a privilege to be here up on the stage with this group of people and honoring my brother Warren for this distinguished award. Just to let everybody know, my mother, who is a past, received this award years ago, fell and broke her arm, and she sends her love and wishes she could be here with everybody, and it's hard for her not to be down here. So she's with us in spirit, but mom was truly counting on coming down here until the little accident that happened. So like I said, like growing up, we were blessed to have a great mom and dad, but we were raised by a series of great mentors and cowboys and workers on the ranch that took us 6 rugrats under their direction and stuff, and it was a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, and truly blessed to have great mentors that taught us the right way to do it, the ethical way to do it, and we didn't, shortcuts weren't taken. We did it the cowboy way, horseback, branding, gathering, sorting, and it was a lot of fun. I'll be honest with you, get the 6 of us kids out doing the fall cattle works with our group. You can just watch one. If Warren has a pair to cut out, you can just look at him, and it just flowed. It's a lot of fun to do that. Lots of stories growing up. Gosh, Warren, he was a hell of a basketball player. So we had lots of. He was a great basketball player. So we played basketball. He baseball, and he's a stand-up gentleman. Hell of a father, grandfather now, and a great brother. I would call Warren kind of our North Star. I followed him. Cimarron schools, and then on to New Mexico Military Institute, New Mexico State University, and back up to the ranch, and been punching cows with him ever since. And that's great honor for me. I'm sorry I get kind of choked up here a little bit, but I'll get things together. But some stories. We always, like Warren said, we were always trotting somewhere. Son of a bitch, always. Either trotting to Crow Creek or trotting to the dispatcher. We were always trotting somewhere. But a hell of a cowpuncher, good ranch manager and boss. He oversees the operation for the CS Cattle Company, and I'm honored to be here up here. One of the stories I'm going to have to tell about the bull, I'm going to tell a story about the Jigs Porter where we'd go and work every summer. We disappeared from Mom and Dad's place every summer. We go and work at Crow Creek where Warren runs his operation there. And we'd stay all summer. And the Jigs Porter, we had a big remuda then, we had a big cable. Jigs roped all of our horses off everybody's, the cowboys and stuff, horses there. About 1972, Marlboro started shooting for the Marlboro Man or Marlboro cigarette commercials at the ranch, I think around 1970, isn't that right, Warren? 69 or 70. Yeah. And one morning there, Marlboro showed up and they did their scene already shot and stuff. And we brought our horses in. We were getting ready to go gather some cattle or something, and Jigs was roping over the photographer for Marlboro had 3 cameras. Back in the old days, were a roll of 36. So he had 3 times 36, and 36, a roll of 36 in these 3 cameras. And we all had our horses caught, and the photographer goes, I'm going to take some more. I want to take some more pictures, Mr. Porter. And Jig says, okay, I'll go ahead. And he says, well, how many do you want me to catch? And this photographer goes, go ahead and rope them and when you miss, we'll stop there. That was the wrong thing to say to Jigs Porter, rope till you miss. So Jigs just started to hula just one at a time, each out, and turn back in. And finally, the damn photographer run out of bullets. and he goes, I'm done, Mr. Porter, I'm done. He says, you win. And Jigs, he chewed Copenhagen, he spit, and just coiled up his big rope there and just walked that to the deal. I'll never forget that. We have a few of those series shots of Jigs roping horses from that photographer there in our office, and it was a pretty cool deal to see. And he built this roping arena there at Crow Creek, and all we wanted to do was rope steers and stuff, and Jigs would get pissed off at us. He says, you guys got to learn how to rope them horses. So about once every 2 weeks, we had to get the horses in and practice, and we could never do it as good as Jigs. We'd get out there, but to satisfy Jigs' part, we got to rope horses and steers, and just had a great time growing up on the ranch with family members. All of them are good people, top hands in anything they do, honest. I'd kind of needle. Warren's nickname is the Bull. So the bull there, I got to where I could needle the bull quite a bit, and he'd get a gut full of me. And one day on Sunday, Mom and Dad thought to get everybody dressed up. We'll go into church there in Cimarron to the Methodist church, and they're going to kind of get us lined out. We're all dressed up there, and I was in the front of the big lawn there, and like all ranches, our swimming pool was a 14-foot aluminum stock tank that was full of moss and nasty water. That was our swimming pool we'd fill up for the summertime. Well, I got to needling Warren one day, or that Sunday there, and he just snapped. And man, he says, I'm gonna whip your ass. And here he comes at me, and I knew I'm in trouble. And I started running as hard as I can. I'm trying to get around to the kitchen door there and get into the house where and I could feel him he was on my back, that big hand right there. And I weighed about 30 pounds, I think. I wasn't very stout. And there was no place for me to go except for the middle of that. I dove into that stock tank in my church clothes. And about that time, Mom and Dad herded the other crew out. And I'm sitting in that middle of that stock tank soaking wet. And Warren's just like a coyote. He's circling that damned stock tank there, wanting to get a hold of me. And Mom comes out and looks at me, and she goes, Randolph, I'll deal with you later. Warren, get in the car. Well, I didn't have to go to church that day, but I saddled a horse and went down to a little cow camp below the headquarters called the Honey House Camp. And I bushed up there till dark. And then I eased back in, and got a talking to from Mom, and Warren glared at me. But that's one of the ones that got lots of stories on him, and he's like I said, a great brother, and love him dearly. And it's indeed a great honor to be here to assist him to get this award here. So thank you all very much, and this is indeed an honor.
Before I let you go, I'm going to put you on the spot. Who's the best cowboy, you or him?
The bull.
You ought to run for political office. That's going to be a political.
And another thing, I was going to say with the bull, Jiggs also, Jiggs was known for castrating horses in that part of the country. And I took since I was 6 or so, 7, I'd go with him and handle all the utensils cutting horses. Well, I got to learn to cut horses and did it for years and years, and I got Jiggs's cutting harness and stuff. Warren, it takes a couple, 3 people. He was one of my line rope men on this harness to lay these colts down when I'd cut them, and he's a good man to have on the cutting harness there. And I did it until a few years ago. I don't cut them anymore.
Randy, he back in the early 80s, he started a hunting outfit operation on the ranch, and it's been going strong ever since. And I give him credit for it. During some of the drought years, it's been a good thing that we've had that hunting to fall back on, or it'd have been some pretty lean times at the CS. And so
he likes.
He does. He can carry his own weight too. He's kind of our ambassador and goodwill man, and you all probably have seen a lot of that side of it here today. And
I kind of heard him last night at the Brandon, and I thought, you know what? I may be losing my job as master of ceremonies.
There you go. That's the mayor. He lived in Dawson, and he was the only one in the town, him and his family, and so Jiggs started calling him the mayor of Dawson, and so to this day I refer to him as the mayor. And so
you were talking about having the Marlboro people out there, and down in the country where I was raised at Seymour, I had the Sixes on one side and had the Wagners on the other side, and I had the Pitchfork, and then I had Swenson's, and so I was kind of circled there, and so they did a lot of those Marlboro commercials there. And one year I was pretty young, but I remember there was a store there in Seymour called the Man Store, and I thought this guy was a genius because in the back of the Western store he had a barber shop. So them guys, when I had to go get my hair cut every 2 weeks, whether I needed one or not, you had to walk past all of that stuff. And I was in there one time, and they had a Marlboro guy in there, and they were giving him a haircut with his hat on. They wanted it to look perfect with the hat on. And so I thought,
can I add to that story?
Yeah.
That just brings something to mind. I was probably about 16 years old. Marlboro sent somebody said, an actor out of Hollywood said, Marlboro says, this guy has the face. They looked at the face with a hat, and so I says, send him out and get a demo shot of him. So they sent him out to Cimarron. There was the production team and a photographer. And he showed up at Crow Creek. No, he showed up in Cimarron first. And the guy he's a good-looking an actor guy, had long hair about down to here. And but his facial features, he was going to make the new Marlboro face. Well, the production guy says, take him into Cimarron and get a haircut. Well, what's the barber? Joe Gonzalez.
Yeah. Was
a little barber there in Cimarron, and I had my permit to drive, so I drive the actor in there with the production man and the photographer, and they started cutting this hippie's hair off, and he was crying. He says, what am I going to do? He said, this is part of the audition. They roached him up pretty good, and so we went to Crow Creek right there in front of the saddle room. They like a scene there where in Warren's saddle room is a lot of Marlboro stills are shot in magazines. They don't use them anymore because most of it's all over the internet. But they cut this poor guy's hair off and then shot about 500 pictures of him, shook his hands and tell him, okay, go back to California, and they never used him. And he didn't know how to put on his spurs or his shafts, or didn't know a damn thing. And I had a hell of a heading horse called Philemon, and I led Philemon out there, and shit, he didn't know how to do anything. and I finally got his spurs on right and his shafts and everything, and the guy said, they sent him back to Hollywood and had to grow his hair again. So that's part of the Marlboro stuff. But they've been coming, at least they've kind of cut it back to about every other year, but started out as a small little a photographer and a couple of horses. Sometimes now it's a full-blown production. It's 80 people. They bring their own horses and 5 or 6 models and stuff like that. But they're all good cowboys, and we've got a pretty good standing relationship. And it was all done with a handshake from my father. We were branding one time right at Crow Creek on the side of the road. This guy drives up, and we're branding there, and he starts taking pictures. He says, I'm Jim Brady from Chicago, and he says, I'm in charge of the Marlboro. And that's how that, and my dad shook it. They've been coming ever since.
You know, in talking about that, I think it's probably one of the funniest things I'd seen, because back in those days, Marlboro had billboards up all around the country with that guy's face on it. And I do remember one of them, because it had the Marlboro guy there, and it said, this is Marlboro country. And right behind the billboard was a cemetery. So I thought that was pretty funny. I'm going to send it down to the end to Pete Bond. Pete, I had the honor to induct you several years ago, and I'm going to turn the stage over to you.
What do you want me to talk about?
It is open. Just give us some ranch stories of what it was like back in the day and some of these other guys that you've worked with.
Well, you were talking about making those long drives. We had a little over 1,000 steers turned out with Mickey Smith and Laramie, outside of Laramie, Wyoming, and Laramie Plains. And Mickey had 3 ranches there. And I know for this country, those pastures weren't that big. There's about 20,000 acres. And we'd gather them about 5 or 6 days ahead and bring them back down and throw them down on the river in some old hay fields. And I was up there and did that, and I didn't want to come back. So Mickey, one of these ranches, he would take them over to the other ranch and leave them there to December. He had a feed yard in McLean. And just timing-wise, it really fit better for him. And they had them in a couple of section traps, and we got up that morning early and gathered that trap. And that's the first time I was ever around any of them flat brim buckaroos. And we got up there to that gate, and those cattle got in a big, bad meal. And I hollered one of them and said, have you ever unwound one? And they said, yeah. And I rode in there to unwind that thing, and nobody came in to back me up, and he closed in over us. And I went to whipping and spurring this little filly, and we started jumping cattle and got out of there. But anyway, we left there, and it was 29 miles. And after about an hour, those cattle was probably scattered out 7 or 8 miles. We'd come, I was behind, and we'd come over a hill, and I'd see the leaders going over the next hill. I'd have given, looking back on that thing, that's the only time in my life I really wish I had a camera. But I tell you one thing, I've rode a horse a lot longer, and I've rode a horse a lot farther. But riding a horse 29 miles in a dead walk, my butt was as sore as I've ever had it in my life. We never got in a trot. It just all was going down the road. And I kept telling Mickey that, Mickey, why are you doing this? You're going to get hung up with these cattle in one of these winters. And he said, we never have. I said, yeah, you will. I'll be damned that winter, it came in there and started storming. And finally, about the 1st of January, he got a snow blower. And I don't know how many trucks he had, but he could take about 5 in at a time. And 5 cats, 5 trucks, and a snow blower, and go in there, load those cattle, then take the cats, the 5 trucks, and the snow blower, because the road had already covered back up, and come out. I mean, there's no telling what that cost him that winter there.
A while ago when I asked you about leaving your brother, and you know, as you get older, your memory sometimes starts to fail. So it wasn't you, it was Shannon, I believe, that left his little brother out on the far end of the pasture one time. Is that correct? Is that ring a bell as well?
I probably left him several times. I can't remember. There's no telling what I did to my brothers or they did to me.
Now, wasn't there one time that y'all were out and I guess you got up close to a rim and your dad told you not to rope that calf up close to the rim and that calf went off the other side, you recall?
No, I can recall a lot of times Dad said don't rope that calf, but and I did it anyway, but I don't recall that one. You know, sitting here thinking of stories and thinking of the men on that plaque. One story that was really fun in my life, I worked at the 4-6s when Mr. J.J. Gibson was the general manager. And they hired me to break the colts. And when they hired me, they told me, they brought me 22 broncs to start. And Dave Lane was the wagon boss there at Dixon Creek when I went to work there. And he said, when you get a horse where you can go with us and make a hand, then you can leave the headquarters. Well, I didn't want to stay at headquarters while everybody else gathered cattle, so just in a day or two, I had something I could gee and haul, and I started going with them. But I had one horse that was a really special horse. He was by a stud they had brought in. His name was Baron Bale, a pitcher horse. And this colt by him was just an exceptional horse, just good-minded, and he traveled good. He did anything I wanted him to do. He's one of the best horses at that time in my life I'd ever got to ride, and I was really fond of him. And so I rode him one day to make a big drive, and it was just too big a day for that horse. And so by the time we got to the roundup, and I had not met Mr. Gibson yet, and when we got to the roundup, my little horse Baron, he was wore out, and I was feeling pretty bad for my little horse. And I noticed over by the corrals was a pickup and a trailer parked with a big buckskin horse in it. And I asked my good friend Bill Glenn Bruton that worked there, I said, what's the horse in the trailer? He said, well, that'd be Mr. Gibson's horse. Said he'll be here after a while and he'll work the roundup. And what Mr. Gibson would do is that he'd usually drive in and get his horse out of the trailer, or maybe somebody had ponied him to the roundup. And if we was branding, he'd drag a few calves or he'd help us for a little while. But he very seldom went on the drive, so they'd bring his horse there. So I looked at Bill Glenn, I said, well, old Barron's give out, I think I'll go ride that one. And Bill Glenn looked at me and he said, well, kid, I don't think I'd do that. I said, well, my horse tired and that one there looks fresh. So being a cocky little kid, I trotted over, and I was 19 years old, and I trotted my horse over and wrapped him in the trailer, and I backed this buckskin horse out, and I stepped on him, and I trotted him over to Roundup, and this horse had been trained by Matlock Rose. And he is the brokest horse in a bridle up to that point I had ever ridden. And I mean, he felt pretty fancy to this little cowboy. So I trotted him back to my spot in the roundup, and I turned him around a time or two, and all the cowboys, they was shaking their head thinking, this is the end of this little guy when Dave and Mr. Gibson get here. And I rode him around there for a little bit, and while we held a roundup, well, sure enough, in a minute, the car pulls in, Cadillac, and it's Dave and Mr. Gibson. And they pull over to where I'm at, and I trotted up there to him, and Mr. Gibson rolled his window down, and he said, son, what's your name? I said, my name's Shannon Hall. And he said, what do you think of Orange Blossom? That was that horse's name. And I said, Mr. Gibson, I believe he's the best horse I ever threw a leg over. He said, well, you just go ahead and ride him this morning. Boy, I stuck my chest out and trotted back to my place in the roundup, and I thought, boy, I've got this figured out. If you're real nice to the general manager, you get to ride his horse.
Tell me what it's like to be able to watch your wife and your daughter, because they followed in your footsteps as well and had quite a lot of success in the cutting horse arena as well.
Yeah, my family's everything. I'm married to this beautiful woman here, Rhonda, and there's not a woman anywhere who's worked any harder. She's been the reason I've had any success at anything. She's intelligent, she's a good businesswoman. She rides a pretty good bronc, but I've only seen her do it one time, and I got some ugly talking to when he quit. But she stayed on him. And she's loped a million circles, a million hours, and she's the backbone to what I've been my whole life, and I just owe everything to her. My daughters, it's so much fun to watch them show. We've been blessed to, two of my daughters have won national championships in cutting and high school rodeo, and that's been a pleasure. And both of them are still active, you know, in rodeo or cutting arena. And then I have one special daughter because she's going to be the world's greatest country dolphin trainer. And I've got high ambitions for her as she does herself. So I'm very blessed with a great family. Yes, sir.
Tell folks that might not know what, if they want to get into the cutting horse industry, what's the two biggest mistakes that people make?
The two biggest mistakes people make getting in the cutting horse industry. One is maybe overestimating their own financial ability to be in the cutting horse industry. No, seriously, probably the first thing I would say is find a person that is not only good, but that you trust, that's a good horseman. Someone that'll assess what you want to do accurately and honestly, obviously has the ability to be successful at it, but more importantly will lead you in the right direction and has a passion for it, someone that loves what they do. And then the other thing is be patient. You know, as anyone that's been in the cutting horse industry knows, that guy back there has won that futurity 5 times. And that's starting way back when it began, and the rest of us have struggled real hard to win it once. So it's hard, and it's elusive, so be patient and, you know, pursue it and enjoy every moment of it. I mean, to me, there's nothing like a good cutting horse and cow horse to ride them. But that's a industry, especially today, that is highly competitive with many great horses, many great trainers. And if you want to get into it, you know, do it because you love it. Buster's given me a lot of good advice over the years training horses. A couple of years ago, he sent a horse for me to train for him, which not only was an incredible honor, but the most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done in my life. You know, when he'd call and say, hey, I want to come up and watch my horse work, I'd say, well, I've had the flu for a few days, you know, because there's that much pressure working a horse in front of that man. But when I went to his house one day and we were working, and I was having just a little trouble on one end with this mare, and he noticed it, which I hoped that day working or I'd be able to not disclose that to him, but he noticed it anyway. And he was telling me some things to do with her. And I asked him, I said, Buster, I said, that's great advice, and it's really helped me. But why didn't you tell me that 20 years ago? And he said, well, I was trying to beat you then. I said, okay.
My wife used to chase cans, and so I told everybody when she was barrel racing, she was always one turn out of sync, but because there's 2 rights and a left or 2 lefts and a right. But I had the opportunity, when she turned 50, I took her over to a guy's place that had an indoor arena, had some cutting horses, and he threw her up on a pretty good cutting horse, and she got out there and worked some cows. And when she stepped off that day, she looked straight at me and said, you shouldn't have done that. Because the bug did hit. I mean, she really loved doing that, and it's just, it's awesome to be able to watch those horses do that.
It will get a hold of you. You know, going back to what my original story there was on the best advice he ever gave me a few years ago, and talking about being in the cutting horse industry and things that you need to do. I had a string of horses that year that were pretty common, and I was working really, really hard at them, probably too hard, trying to make something out of them that they weren't. And I was struggling, I was getting discouraged. And so I called Buster and I said, we're going to work horses in Graham, Texas. Would you come watch me and give me some advice? And he said he would. So we went to Graham, and he drove up there, and he watched me work all my horses that day. And I tried to be on my best behavior and work them at my very best level that day, even though they were pretty common little horses. And after I'd worked, I helped a couple other guys work, and I looked over there and he was gone. And I rode over and I asked my friend Ping Golf, who had been sitting with Buster all day, I said, where'd Buster go? He said, well, he said he had to get back to the ranch. And I was like, are you kidding me? And he said, no, he had to get back to the ranch. They just let the air out of me because he'd come to watch me and give me some good advice. And so I sulked around home for 2 or 3 days thinking he let me down. And the phone rings, and it's Buster. And the first thing he said is, he said, I've been thinking. And when Buster says, I've been thinking, you're in trouble. That's just inevitable. It's coming. And I said, well, what have you been thinking about? And he said, well, I watched you work those horses. And he said, you know, they are what they are, Shannon. I said, yes, sir. He said, but why do you do that? And I said, what do you mean, why do I do what? He said, well, why do you work those horses? And I thought a minute, and I knew he was trying to get me to think of something, and I said, well, I'm not sure what you mean. He said, why do you work those horses, those cutting horses? And I said, well, from the first time I did it, I love to ride a horse, and I love to work cattle, and that's why I do this. He said, well, then go back to loving riding a horse and loving working cattle, and don't worry about what those horses are. They'll be what they are. But if you don't go back to loving it, they're not going to be anything. And so the rest of that year, I went about it because I loved doing it, not because I had to accomplish a task. And that year, I made the semifinals on both of my horses. Actually made the finals on the one, and that'd be the only finals that little horse ever made because he's pretty limited physically. But I had 12 horses that year, and 11 of them won money at futurity. They were very plain, but they were trained because I just went back to loving what I did every day. And that's the best advice he gave me, and that's what I would do.
Warren, I'm going to come back to you for a minute. Have you got a story about your little brother down there?
Oh, I don't know if I can top that one, but we had scraps when we were young, but it seemed like, we were the closest in age of the boys, and so it seemed like we was always together, and I just can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but one story or one goings on that I think I was the only one of us boys that ever got to go down to my grandfather Albert Mitchell's and help them brand, and I don't know why they didn't get to go, but when I was a young, I really loved flanking calves, and so my granddad loved to rope, and I don't think he ever got off his horse for anything other than roping, but I was able to go down and help them brand for 4 or 5 years when he was towards the end of his, probably he died when he was 81 or so, and so probably from 70 to 76 or so, his age. Well, it was probably about that same time in the early 70s, and him being able to see him drag calves and be around him working, and that was the only time that I was ever able to do that. And then the last year I went down there, Jiggs, that was one thing, Jiggs, he got us started roping, dragging calves early. I mean, we didn't do that where he drug all the calves. He'd turn us kids loose in there, and we got to drag calves from an early age. And so that last year I went down to Grandpa's to help him. He wasn't there the last day, and so my uncle put me on his horse, and I was able to make a hand and drag pretty good, and he got me another horse when that one got tired, and I was able to drag two bunches, and so I was the only one of the kids that really got down and was able to work with and alongside my grandfather, and so I value that a lot.
Pete, I'll come back down to the far end on you, and as you look at the plaque across the street of all the different guys that have won the Foy Proctor Cowman's Award, is there one person that really stands out in your mind that was maybe a mentor to you and some of the things that they taught you?
Yeah, I think Bill Kraft is the smartest man running the ranch I ever knew in my life, by far. One of the things he always did, if he had a ranch that run 1,000 cows, he'd run about 700 and take in 600-700 yearlings. Well, if it got dry, we wouldn't take the yearlings in. Something else he did that I've never seen any other rancher do, and it's absolutely brilliant. When calves are high, he never kept a replacement heifer. He sold them all. Culled his cows, took in a few more yearlings. When calves got cheap, he kept all of his good heifers back and bred them. So his actual true cost of his cow herd was nothing because he stocked it with cheap heifers. He was also doing something that he didn't realize he was doing. It was an accident. The cattle cycle used to work on a 10 or 11 year cycle. He was keeping heifers out of old cows. They were old for a reason. He may have had some younger cows in there that were better cows. would have made better cows, but these old cows were proven. Years ago, he got to figuring up for $1 a head, he could not afford to palpate his cows in the fall. He was getting way up in the 90s on breed up. And at Brandon, any dry cow was cut off and went to town. He didn't have to spend that $1 a head, and that cow is fat, and she was in a better cow market. That's just a few of the things Bill did. His son-in-law bought a ranch up there in north of Clarendon, and of course Cade wanted it, his brush, and Cade wanted it cleared, and Bill said, just wait a minute and let me think about it. And a little bit, several weeks later, here comes a D7 in, and Cade said, what's that? I said, that's your new bulldozer. I bought that thing off down south real cheap. We got an extra camp over there, and I hired an 80-year-old cat skinner that's been retired. And we're going to pay him minimum wage and furnishing him a house. And just let him grub mesquite when he wants to. Well, this old man had been retired all he wanted to. He was out there grubbing mesquite when it was snowing. And it took him a little longer than what Cade wanted to do, but there again, the cost of clearing that ranch was a whole lot cheaper than what anybody else could have done it, except done it that way. A lot of things Bill has done, and Bill has told me his mind works different, and it basically all goes down to how can we do this at the cheapest cost. And another thing, like what you have to do, like what Bill does when he sells all of his heifers, you can't spend that money. And by God, Bill didn't spend it, so. Mm-hmm.
Shannon, I know you don't take any outside horses anymore much. It's just for family or friends, but I know that you do some things for the 4-H club as far as some horsemanship clinics. Why'd you get involved in that?
Well, I enjoy teaching. I especially like teaching the kids with the horses and stuff. Two experiences that really, I guess, built a passion for that. Years ago, a lady that I had ridden horses for, her boss, her name actually is Megan, her boss was a gentleman named Terry Gronke from the East Coast. And they were starting a program that rehabbed crippled children and wounded veterans with horses. And it was amazing watching what a horse would do to a person that had a handicap and how they could help them rehab. And she sent me a video of a young girl loping a horse on a lunge line, waving her arms and hollering, "Watch Mom." And when I watched the video, my first thoughts were, well, that's kind of neat. But the story behind it is that little girl had been born and couldn't walk or couldn't talk and didn't for years. She was about 7 or 8 in the video, and she had learned all of her mobility had come once she started just simply being set on a horse and led up to the point that she could be lunged loose by herself. And they wanted me to come and do a clinic. And when she explained that to me, I said, I'm all in. So I've been active for several years now with it. The name of their program is Brave Hearts, and the rewards of working with those veterans that gave so much for us. Some of those men and women that have had arms and legs taken off because of being in the war, and seeing the rewards, or even dealing with the mental aspects of war, and seeing a horse bring those people back to normal life or enjoying life. There's nothing compares to that. And then doing some 4-H things, just, in order for, I have a passion that this Western way of life that everyone under this tent gets to enjoy, I'm telling you, it's short-lived. You go to where I live in Oklahoma, southern Oklahoma, and the cowboy is a rare find. It's hard to find a guy that even wants to ride a horse all day, much less just be a cowboy. And if we don't preserve that heritage, the people under this tent, it's lost. And so by doing clinics with 4-H kids, not only can I teach them horsemanship and hopefully build them a passion for a horse and a way of life, but I can share what's important to me with a generation that has no clue. They don't understand anything about our way of life. I share a funny story. our youth pastor at our church, I shared this with the group today, this afternoon, but our youth pastor at our church, we replaced him, but we're looking to replace him. And so I've stepped in and helped some. So I've been speaking to our youth group at our church, and they're all city kids. It's not a country church. We go to church in Duncan, Oklahoma, so they're all city kids, and trying to relay God's word to these kids and using my experiences as a cowboy, which they're not familiar with. And I felt led last week to explain to them that in life, we believe God is in control, but actually God's in charge. We're in control. We're the one that makes the choice to give our life to Him or not, and we're the one that makes the choice to allow Him to lead us in life or not. He's in charge, but we're really in control. And in demonstrating this to these city kids, I was explaining a few years ago how we went through a blizzard. I believe it was 2009. For us, it was a blizzard. To these guys that live in the mountains, they'll laugh at my little story, but we did have 11 inches of snow and a 60-mile-an-hour wind, and that's a blizzard to me, whether you believe it or not. But we were calving heifers at that time, and thanks to this man, Mark Gardner, we don't have to pull any anymore, but still, because of a heifer's lack of experience, which all of us cattlemen understand, in a snowstorm, sometimes she's going to need some assistance. And I was explaining to these city kids that a cow understands that when she lays down and has a calf, out comes something back there, and she jumps to her feet, and she licks it off just like your mothers did y'all. And all these city kids looked at me like. And what was really funny was all these city kids' mothers in the back of the group going. And that was just last Wednesday. I may not get to speak to the youth anymore. But I have a passion for sharing my Western way of life with a world that doesn't understand it anymore. Because if we don't preserve that, if events like this don't continue, and people don't watch this on that internet, this way of life is a lost way of life. And I hate to see that. I have a passion for that to continue.
You know, you bet. That was one of the things, because I did Stock Show Confidential on RFD TV for 3 years, and we traveled the entire United States to tell the Stock Show story. And you ask most people where they get their food, and they tell you the grocery store, because they have no idea of what it takes to bring those cattle along or grow the vegetables that we do eat. But I think one of the guys summed it up as well as anybody I'd ever heard, because we were at one of the shows, and obviously these are 4-H and FFA kids, and he said the nice thing about this is the boys look like boys and the girls look like girls. Randy, anything else to share with us down on that end? Because last night you were kind of in rare form, but...
Well, I'd just like to say the ranch has been in our family since 1873, and we plan on going another 100 and something years. So we're going to continue to do the same thing that was handed down to us. The core family is strong. We have good goals to keep it going, to keep this lifestyle in the community there. The ranches around us are owned by, bigger, from Ted Turner to places like that. We're the family that's descendants of the family the people that started it, and we're geared up to go keep it going again. And through Warren's leadership and example, we're strong. We're going to keep doing it. Plus, hell, we don't know what else to do. So it's good to pass that down.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I tell you what, let's take a short break here for a little bit. Why don't you pay these guys off? What a wonderful job they did. Some great stories. Again, if you're following us on the World Wide Web, we will be back with you here shortly. And a little later on, a chuck wagon feed for all you guys. And I will tell you real quick, be sure and offer your best wishes to Shirley Newcomb that is over cooking. She was in a pretty bad horse accident this last week, but I'm telling you what, she's tougher than boot leather for her to show up today and be able to prepare this food. So be sure and tell her thank you. And we'll be back with you here in just a little bit. Pat, you got anything else? All right. We'll be back with you shortly.
Thank you.
Donnie, since you're right here by me, I'm just going to start with you, my friend. We had the opportunity to chat last night, and you were telling me some stories. Tell me about raising this young man.
It was a challenge. Now, when Shannon and his brother came to live with me, a few days after they got here, like he said, we went to the barber shop and got a haircut, and his older brother at least had to take his necklace off. I can't remember Shannon wearing one, and his older brother looked over and says, "What in the world have we got into?" But I'm blessed to have those boys. I'm blessed to have the other two that are younger than they. All of my boys are successful. I thank God that I was able to raise all four of these boys in the country. Raised all four of these boys on the Lewis ranches. They had 26,000 acres, a portion of the Lewis estate, to run and play in. Shannon didn't tell you the story about he and his brother leaving their little brother on the backside of the horse pasture. The horse pasture is about 5 or 6 sections, and they came in without their little brother, and he was about 6. And it scared me. It made me mad, and it scared me. But by the time it was all over with, they didn't ever do that anymore. That was the end of that. They never ran off and left Shane again. But Shannon grew up wanting to be a world champion calf roper in high school. He and a friend of his named Junior Crump came in one day, and they were so proud of themselves. They had roped a buffalo and had it in the trailer, horse trailer. And I said, "What are you boys doing?" "Oh, we roped this buffalo such and such and such and such." Well, one of your past inductees was Jig's Man. This was Jig's Man's pet buffalo that they had roped and hauled in. I said, "Turn around and take him right back where you got him." And they did, over about 20 miles of muddy dirt road, and they had to take that buffalo back and dump him out where they got him from. But I grew up in Clarendon, Texas, a part of the Panhandle. I grew up working for the McMurtry's, and I worked for the J.A. Ranch, and I worked for Hedgecote Ranch, but I went to work for the Lewises in 1972. My dad had always told me, he said, "If you ever get a chance to go to work for Billy Lewis, go to work for him." And I did in 1972. And it was a good ranch. It was a good place to be. It was a good place to raise kids. It was a cowboy ranch. We did everything the cowboy way, and did so until they went out of business. I think they went out of business about 1996 for the biggest part, but I'm thankful to have been able to do that. Things happened on that ranch that I tried to tell some of the college kids. After I moved to town, I had some stalls there, and I was still training horses, and I'd rent some of my stalls out to the college kids, and I'd try to tell some of the college kids how we started colts and stuff, you know. They'd look at me like, "Oh man, you do not have a clue what you're talking about." But you know, those things happened, and all these stories that you hear, they happen. And thank goodness that I've told several of my cowboy friends, we were very fortunate. We got to see the best part of the old ways and the best part of the new ways. We grew up in just exactly the right time. We got to experience all these things, you know. They don't do things like we did when I was on the ranch. We pull pranks on each other. Now then, you're scared to death to pull a prank on another cowboy because you might get sued if he gets bucked off. We didn't worry about it. That's what we were looking for, and we laughed. We had fun, you know. We just enjoyed it. My very best friend in this world is Johnny Hill, and we pulled pranks on each other. I was dragging calves in a branding one day, and somebody said, "Look out." And I raised my head up, and a wet calf fry wrapped right around my nose. He had thrown it from the branding fire and hit me, and we did things like that, but we had fun. We enjoyed what most of you probably know that a cowboy's life is not, you don't get very many finances. It's not very, it won't make you a rich man. And I could have had jobs that would have paid me a lot more money
but I never would have had a job that I loved every single day that I went to work. Every day was different. The Lewis ranches worked cattle 8 months out of every year. And we did all of our ranch. We did ranch work. All of our cow work was done horseback. We enjoyed it. I remember when the granddaddy of the ranch rodeos, Wichita Falls, started in 1981. They invited the Lewis ranches to be a part of that first year. And we were the underdogs. Everybody, all they could talk about was some of these larger ranches up there. And the Lewis ranches won it that year. And we're thrilled. And we came back again and won it in 1983. We competed in 11 years, and we were always a contestant for 11 years, and I enjoyed that. That was a great thing, and you got to show off your cowboy skills, and they're still doing it today. But Wichita Falls was the granddaddy of that. I don't know if they get the recognition that they should deserve, but they were. I've had the pleasure of working cattle with Buster Welch. I wanted to tell Mr. Welch how much I appreciate him taking an interest in this offspring of mine and doing what you can to help him. He needed all the help he could get, Buster. But anyway, we had a good life, and it was good being able to grow up. I worked with Bill Kraft, one of your other inductees, and know some funny stories and things about Bill Kraft and what he would get himself into, if you've ever heard Bill Kraft. Bill Kraft is a great man. Bill Kraft was a little bit close, but Bill Kraft was a good man. I worked for the McMurtry's, as I said, my dad did, and Mrs. McMurtry, she said, that old Bill Kraft, you know, she didn't have anything good to say about Bill because he took a lease out from under her on Oaks Creek Ranch at Clarendon. But I knew all these people. I worked for the JAs. Then I became a commissioner after I left the ranch in 1998 or something, became a county commissioner for 16 years, and I had the privilege of being the commissioner in Precinct 2 in Donnelly County. The first commissioner of that precinct was Charles Goodnight, and that was an honor. My precinct took in a lot of the JA ranch, and so I told my wife as we were coming up, and we came through Clarendon and down through Lubbock, and I drove out on the hill out there south of Clarendon, and I looked as far as I could see, those blue hills over yonder, and blue hills south and blue hills east, and I said, I've been horseback on everything that you can see. As far as you can see, I've been horseback on it. And I thank God. I thank God for that privilege. We're a blessed people, and let's do everything we can to carry on this tradition. Even though these young bucks think you're crazy, old man, you don't know what you're talking about, it's true, and keep it up. I'd like to say that. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah. You know, Donnie, you said something that I've heard all my life, and they talk about that a man's wealth is not measured by his bank account. He's measured by the number of friends that he has, and it appears that you're a very, very wealthy man. So, it reminded me of a story, though, real quick before I turn it over. He was talking about running for county commissioner, and they talked about that guy that was running for public office, and he had gone around and he'd gone to every house in the neighborhood, and he went way out in the country, and he knocked on the door, and the lady came up there, and as soon as she saw him, she just started to slam the door, and he just stuck his foot in the door real quick. He said, ma'am, he said, I'm running for, and she didn't even let him get finished. She said, I know who you are, and I know what you're doing, and if you was the last human being on the face of the earth, I wouldn't vote for you. So he went back to his pickup, and he got his notepad out, and he wrote by her name, Maybe. So, you know. Ralph Miller, you've got a train story, I understand.
Well, when Mr. Buster Welch called me and asked me to do a story about putting cattle on a train, I thought, Lord of mercy, everybody in the world's put cattle on a train. And the last time I put cattle on a train was in 1951, so there's a lot of people here that haven't put cattle on a train. But I want to tell you another story. I've heard a lot of people today talk about Mr. Welch and about his horses and all that. I want to tell you a story about from the horses side of view to Mr. Welch. I was in Fort Worth, Texas at a futurity. Mr. Welch was standing there, and he had sold a horse to a man, and Mr. Welch will know this horse. His name was Bar Money. And this man come to him and told him, he said, Mr. Welch, I wish you'd watch my horse work. He said, I don't know what's the matter. He said, man, he said, we're just not doing anything with him. And he said, we just can't get along. I watched that man walk up to the fence and watched that horse work for about 5 minutes. And then he said, young man, you better get your mind on your business. That little horse won that futurity. In my estimation, that man is the greatest horseman that has ever lived. I think we need to give him a hand. My story is a little bit different from what we're talking about, because I'm going to try to kind of give you a brief history on what the transportation of cattle were like back in my younger days. You know, when long years ago, before the Texas Revolution, the Mexican government was giving families land to come down and settle to try to keep the Indians from raiding in old Mexico. My grandmother's family settled, and they built a place called Fort Parker down close to Mejia, Texas. Some of you might remember of hearing of a woman called Quanah Parker, or hearing an Indian called Quanah Parker. His mother was from my family. And as we go through this thing, we think about whenever the Civil War broke out, all of the troops were pulled out of Texas, and the Indians began to raid again. And so the people began to move back east, move back east, move back east, and they abandoned their livestock and just left them where they were. But they had to move back to get protection. Now, when the Civil War ended, these cattle had multiplied into vast numbers, and they were gathered, and the only way to get them to market where all the people were was to drive them to a railhead somewhere in Kansas. So they put together those mass herds, and they drove them up there. A cow will fatten if you don't drive her more than about 10 or 12 miles a day. She'll gradually gain weight all the way up there. And by the time you think about a cow covering 10 miles a day and going from here to Kansas City, she'd be in pretty good, her steer would be in pretty good shape by the time you got there. And when the Civil War was over with and people began to come back and little settlements sprung up everywhere, why, it was no longer feasible to drive cattle anyway. So the railroads began to think about designing some kind of a method to transport cattle. And they built a car. It was 9 feet wide. They had 2 lengths, 36 foot or a 40 foot. They had slatted sides, and they began to build these pens along the railroad. I've seen stock pens on the T&P. I've seen them on the RS&P. I've seen them on the Santa Fe. I've seen them on the Milwaukee. Every one of them were exactly the same. The same man must have built every one of them. You remember that, don't you? Yeah, they were all built the same. They were all built out of 2x12 lumber. The posts were 8x8 and 8 feet out of the ground. They had a flat top, flat 2x12 on top that you could walk around on top of the deal. And you could load 2 cars at a time. They had 2 chutes coming up that you could load 2 cars at a time. Now, it took 25 cars of cattle to make a train. And if you made a train, why, they would put an engine and a caboose on that 25 cars, and then you could send them straight through wherever you wanted them to go. And if you loaded 25, they'd have an engine and a crew to spot the cars for you. Now, I'm sure you've all seen the show Monty Waltz where they rope the smoke tack on the engine because they blow the whistle. I witnessed one episode of that in my lifetime. At Justisburg, Texas, they stampeded a herd for us, and they didn't rope the smokestack, but they did rope the engineer and the fireman out of the deal. But anyway, they spotted those cars for you, and those cattle happened to be unloaded every 24 hours. You could sign a waiver, and they could be unloaded every 36 hours. But normally, if you shipped cattle, they were unloaded every 24 hours and watered and fed and loaded back up. So it took a long time for cattle to get anywhere. Normally, we shipped cattle from here to South Dakota. It took approximately 2 weeks for a cow to get from here to South Dakota to do that. But if you didn't load a train, why, you could get the section crew. The railroads weren't like they are today. You had little areas, each section, they had a crew of people that took care of the rails and took care of the water and took care of the cold storage and all that, because they were all steam engine. They weren't diesel. And those crews would spot cars for you. Didn't have to have an engine. They had a tool that was called a camel's foot. It was about a steel about 8 foot long, weighed about 30 pounds, and the bottom of it looked like actually shaped like a camel's toe. You stuck that up in under that deal and you prized down on it, and you could move that car. You could move that car along. Now, everything the railroad built, you thought they were shipping elephants in place of cows, because them old pens were absolutely the heaviest lumber you ever saw. And there was a gap between where the loading chute was and the railroad, so the cars wouldn't hit it. And you had to pick up they called it a bull board, and you pick it up and turned it over, and it laid down, and the cow would walk across it. The 2 gates shut to the side of the car. It took 2 men to turn that thing over. And you had to put the cattle in, and then they had a board, they called it a rub board, that sat in the door, and then you could close the stockyard door, and they'd pinch the car down, and you'd load another car. And if you shipped a train of cattle, why, you were allowed to put a man or 2 men, whatever you wanted, on the train to take care of your cattle, and it was free. They'd take you to wherever you're going and bring you back free of charge. They didn't charge you for any freight on it. So, and you shipped those cattle, and then when you got to where they were going, why, they weren't in good shape. You had to give them a few days. And when the big boom really come in shipping cattle was about 1903. The federal government had set aside land in South Dakota, the Cheyenne Indian Reservation, and the Standing Rock Reservation. And they decided to lease that grass to the ranchers. And people that probably most of us are familiar with here was the Matadors. Murdo McKenzie went there and leased 500,000 acres of that land. And they shipped 50,000 head of cattle into Evitts, South Dakota. Evitts was on the east side of the Missouri River, and the Milwaukee Railroad built a barge across the Missouri to bring those cattle over on the east side to the reservations. And these were all grass-fat cattle. It took about 2 years for a steer to get into beef. So they were shipping cattle in and shipping cattle out all the time. The railroad bought a string of townships in between those 2 reservations. It was 6 miles long, or 6 miles wide and 80 miles long. And you could use that deal to ship cattle, move cattle back and forth to Evitts to ship them out of there. So we shipped cattle in to South Dakota. The time that I remember the most of, we loaded the train at Justisburg, Texas, and unloaded them at Faith, South Dakota. When we got to Faith, the siding wasn't long enough to hold the box cars, so we unloaded what we could at the railroad yard and moved the other down to the depot. And they pulled a freight wagon up beside the car, and we opened the door, and those cows jumped out on that wagon and off on the ground. They didn't go nowhere because the grass was lush, and they were so hungry they just stopped and their heads dropped to the ground, and it took 2 days to get them to even move there. But as time went on, in the 50s, later, that was the last time that I remember. The next year we shipped cattle, we shipped them by trucks. Now the trucks were great big back then, where they were 20 foot long. A lot of the trailers were 20 foot. Later, the next year, we got some 30-foot trailers. Boy, it could move a lot of cattle with a 30-foot trailer. But it didn't take but about 30 hours to get those cattle from Texas to South Dakota, where we were taking 2 weeks with them before. And today, we're shipping cattle on 53-foot pots. They haul a trainload of cattle. They don't haul a few, they haul a trainload. So that's kind of the history of what I've been through as far as the cattle business is concerned.
Incredible, just incredible. Frank Kelton, I'm going to slide right on down to you, and you got a Shannon story for us, I think?
Well, I've got quite a few, actually. I worked for Shannon for about 10 years. Well, I mean a year. Some days it seemed like 10 years. But he was awful good to me. That was a nice compliment, Shannon. Thank you. I don't feel like I deserve that or even to be up here with the people I'm here with. But I've got some funny stories that happened at Shannon's. I had a great time working there. Learned a lot. He made me mad several times, and I made him mad several times, I'm sure. But there's a couple of times that he voiced his opinion on it too. But the first time that he made me mad was I'd been around cows all my life, and I thought I knew a cow. And he told me, he said, there's the colts, just go ahead and get started. Didn't tell me which ones to start. I think there was 30-something there, wasn't there, Shannon? And I just starting colts. I didn't have a clue what was going on, what I was supposed to do. I just got on and started riding. Well, he told me one day, he said, well, I seen you trotting by the other day. He said, the colt looked pretty good. He said, go ahead and get your colt started on cattle. I had never done that. I didn't have a clue what was going on. Well, he come up to me about a month later, and he said, Frank, he said, you need to learn how to read a cow better. And I went, what? I've been around cows all my life, and you're telling me I need to learn how to read a cow better. And I later figured out he was right. But one time he did voice his opinion to me, and he come over and asked me, he said, did you get through all your colts today? I said, well, no, sir, I didn't. This went on about 3 or 4 days. And finally, that last day, he said, Frank, what's the problem? Why can't you get through all your colts? I said, well, Shannon, I don't know. I start at daylight and I quit at dark. I said, I can only do what I can do. He said, well, maybe you need to try a little harder. I said, well, yes, sir, I sure will. And he turned around, walked off, and he goes, how many colts are in your string? I said, 17. He goes, nobody can ride 17 colts in a day and do it right. He said, give some to somebody else. But there was, he went somewhere and found a little saddle that was cheap. I mean, it was cheap. He was proud of this. I think he gave $150 for it or something like that, and he brought it over to me. I looked at it, I was like, all right, I just hung it over there. But we had a guy by the name of Zach Henning working for us. And Zach was, Shannon told Zach, he said, ride that saddle. And Zach told him, he said, I don't like that saddle. And he said, why can you ride it? And he said, well, because I ride like I'm from Texas and you ride like you're from Kansas. Well, Zach, it come into it, it made him mad. And he rode that saddle every day. Well, finally one day, he was working a horse and the rigging pulled out of that saddle. And Zach hit the ground and he said, well, do I still ride like I'm from Kansas? He said, you rode it all the way to the ground, Zach. Good job. But Pat said something a little bit ago. He said, if my dad would talk a little bit, he would know that he was here. Well, one year we was backing a trailer up, and the guy that was backing Dad up said, why don't you get over here and back him up? He said, because for some reason, he said, you two can communicate without even saying anything. And I said, well, all right. So I backed him up, and he said, see, y'all didn't say anything. I said, well, if you learn how to read a spit, you know exactly how to, what you need to do. And that's very true for the people that have worked with my dad. When he spits just right, you better find something to do real quick like, whether it's right or wrong. But last fall I was helping the Fernandezes, which Doug has gotten this award before. And I was doing something different this year. I had a kid with me, so they put me in a different spot, and Ed was telling everybody what to do, and I was trying to get over there to hear what was going on and what we needed to do. And I got over there and I said, Ed, I'm sorry I didn't hear you. I said, what are we doing? He said, did I say something? I said, well, yes, sir. He said, well, what did I say? I said, well, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. And he said, well, now you know what it feels like to be working for the Keltons. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Go down to one of the finest cattlemen anywhere in the country, Mark Gardner.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And I would just say, you guys are my heroes. And, you know, Frank, I'm that guy that rides like he's from Kansas. Because I am from Kansas. And, you know, my father, Henry Gardner, is my greatest hero. And one day when I was very young, he said, Buster Welch is coming to see us. And I'm like, my God, Dad, that's the king of the cowboys. He said, oh, he's just Buster, we're friends, and he's going to come and look at some cattle. And Buster came, and I was like, yes, sir, Mr. Welch, it's very good to meet you. And like many of us have been through this. And we went through it, and of course, he was so charismatic, and he picked out some bulls. And he looks me in the eye, and he says, next year when I get bulls, you're going to do it. And you better do it right. Okay. And I said, yes, sir, I will. And so I've never been so scared in my life as when I sorted those bulls, loaded them up, took them to Rotan, Texas, and he looks at me, slaps me on the back and says, you know, you did even better than I did. And so I passed that first test, and so he became, you know, he became just Buster to me. And sometimes when Buster's in a hurry, I mean, I've heard him call Papa and the boss and everything else, but I get this phone call as we get cell phones and they're a little better, and Buster calls. He said, do you know Shannon Hall? I said, no, sir, I don't know Shannon Hall. Well, he's one of the greatest horse trainers of all time. He needs bulls, and you better take care of him. Click. He did give me his phone number, so I called Shannon Hall. And I said, Mr. Hall, my name is Mark Gardner, and Buster Welch says I'm supposed to take care of you. And so that was one of the great days of my life when I met Shannon Hall via phone, and we talked about things, and we worked about things. And I will say, from my experience of being able to hang out with him and do things, and I'd asked Buster, I said, do you think Shannon Hall would train a horse for me? And he said, well, I don't know about that, but you could ask him. So I called him and I said, Mr. Hall, would you train a horse for me? And he said, well, what do you want to achieve? I said, you know, I'm kind of like the Davises. We roped a lot and we had fun. And my brother and I called those horses we rode back then because we roped big steers, 800-pounders. And I said, I'm tired of riding rock crushers, and I would like to learn how to ride better and work with smarter horses. And so he said, come on, let's go. And so what we did then I was trying to earn my weight and pull my weight, so we would preg check some cattle, we would AI heifers, and we would do all these things. And I got to be with these wonderful young ladies. And one day, we were talking about this and that and the verbalization. And Henry Gardner was my first boss on verbalization. And one day Whitney was really frustrated. And she said, I don't know what you want me to do, Dad. And they had a discussion and this and that. And I had the opportunity. I said, Whitney, what you don't understand is if you have to ask, when they were not talking, you weren't listening. And so those subliminal signals and all of that example that they gave was just so important. And I hung out and I basically was a loper, but they'd let me ride this horse or that horse. And the crew, much like Frank was, one day was going pretty well and everything. They were taking a little break, and Shannon used to have a mustache, a bright red mustache, and it was the right opportunity. They say, Shannon, sometimes when you're verbalizing this and that, we're not quite sure what you need and what you mean. He said, well, and they talked about that. He said, sometimes you talk about that passion and that love of the horse, you know. But they say, Shannon, sometimes that passion, your mustache glows. And he got the biggest smile I've ever seen on him, and he said, am I as intense as Buster? And they go, we think so, we think so. And so we go through this and we look at it, and I would say to the Davises, I've got to be on your ranch, and I got to meet Mr. Les Davis. Linda Davis is a hero and a friend of mine. And I think about the things, and you know, Randy and my brothers, and people often say on the family ranches, they go, how do y'all get along? You know, and I go, we don't. And that's rule number one, that you have to understand that we don't. But we talk about Henry's rules at our ranch, and Henry's rules are, at the end of the day, and much like this family right here, at the end of the day, if we don't work together, and we don't have the love of God and the love of the opportunity that we have to do this, this way of life will disappear. And so I'm going to tell you why you're my heroes. And I'm a little bit like Randy. I get emotional about this because the greatest blessing of my life was when our entire ranch burned. And, you know, we had all these opportunities, and basically our county's a 600,000 acre county in Clark County, Kansas, and 500,000 acres of it burned. And, you know, my friends were texting me. Shannon Hall was front and center texting me, are you okay? Are you in the middle of it? I go, yeah, we're pretty much the epicenter. So when I get the emotion and I get to talk about these things, and I think about the opportunity, and it wasn't about the stuff that was lost, you know, it was about what you people and what American agriculture did to help each other. The things that you did, that is America. And we were trying to work with everybody, and we were thinking, and we were talking, and you know, we were primarily commuting with cell phones, and basically everything was gone. But the cattle that remained, we didn't have anything to feed them. And so my cousin, David Arnold, I was checking on him, and he's about 10 miles away. I said, you okay? You got any hay? He said, yeah, Shannon sent hay. I go, Shannon who? He goes, Shannon Hall. I go, I didn't know you knew Shannon. Well, Shannon found out I needed help. Shannon helped. Shannon sent trucks. He sent hay, and all of you did. Dawson Burns brings all kinds of you know, metal posts and supplies. And the point of it all ends up being Buster Welch, all you guys, the heroes that are in this room of American agriculture. That's cool. That's fun. That's what we enjoy. But the greatest blessing of my life is to know the example that Shannon Hall has shown, and you have all shown to us, about how to be a man.
Yes, amen.
And how to love your life and love your Lord more than anything else, to where you raise a family like this Hall family, and you raise a family like these cowboys here. And it's not about the stuff. It's about the opportunity that we have to leave this place better than we found it. So when my brothers and I grumble at each other, and when my sons who are with us now, my nephew, we figure it out at the end of the day. So some of the greatest cattlemen that have ever walked this earth, and certainly some of the greatest horsemen that ever walked this earth. But I will say to you that Shannon Hall, for as great a horse trainer as you are a better man. Yes. Thank you very much.
You talk about powerful, and that's the reason that we're here, is to hear stories like this of the friendships that you develop. I will tell you this: Shannon did tell me that the limousine bulls were not near as good as what he got from you, so I do know that for a fact. But neat guy. Let's go down to Ken Welch. I had the opportunity to share the stage with Ken many times in the storytelling, as well as being able to induct him here. And Ken, you got a story about the King Ranch down there for me?
Well, I was going to lead off with some other stuff, but that's the trouble if you follow Mark Gardner. He used it all there. All the things I want to talk about, he's already covered. But I told Billy a while ago, and Mark discovered it again, but I believe we're the only generation that got to grow up with our heroes. In our parents' day, they were so busy making a living, and the world was more unpopulated and uncommunicatable, because smoke signals was about the best you had where we grew up. So they didn't get to know each other and do all that, but we got to watch them and be around them more, and I don't think there'll be another generation like that that gets to grow up around their heroes. So it's something that we carry with us as we go, but I'll be honest with you, I've got two hands, and neither one of them could be the mayor of this city or probably the mayor of the city where we live, but both of them have made a life choice that this is what they want to do for a living. So in the morning, when they get up, I don't have to inspire them. They know their job is take care of the livestock, take care of the land, and take care of their family. And I tell people all the time that what we do for a living is a horrible way to make a living, but boy, it's a wonderful way to live. Amen. So if you get to raise kids and stay in country that you admire, then I think it's a pretty good trade-off. So, but he stole all the air out of that. I will tell you this: when I grew up, I'm not going to tell cutting horse stories or ranch stories with those two guys here. So I'll tell you that I knew I was never going to be another Buster Welch, and what most people didn't know about him was there's a wonderful book, if y'all never read it, called Wild at Heart. And it tells the story that men are supposed to be wild at heart and learn how to control themselves. Well, by the time I'd got old enough to make them tracks with him, my dad had learned how to control his wild at heart. But I wanted mine turned loose more than theirs were, so I let them ride the cutting horses, and I tried to get out and do the wild western things. So I learned to ride broncs, and John Welch and I have done more things that weren't very smart, and actually we kind of walk with a limp today because of some of them, but we wanted to live like that. So when Dad took that job down to King Ranch, I've cowboyed with the best, so what am I going to do down there? I'll go down and help them, sure. We go down and they've got a big roundup, and they cut out of this roundup, and they got a bunch of longhorn steers over there, and they take the cuts to them. It's probably 200 yards over to that cut. And so when they start, it's quite a bit of work. And then when they get a bull that doesn't want to go, and it gets hot down there starting at about 6:15 in the morning, and by 11 it's really hot, and those bulls just run out of air and don't want to go. They just make a horsehide corral around them, and off they go with them. And that bull, he might not want to go, but he's going to that cut. So I'm going and I'm thinking, now this is my kind of life. I could live like this. And lo and behold, one of those bulls just give up and rolled over underneath this boy's horse, and it rolled his horse over on top of him, and he's in the sand, and the bull's in the sand, and the horse in the sand. The horse got up and left, and that boy got up, and the horse is running off, and he's looking at it, and that bull is still on his back trying to get turned over out of that loose sand. That boy just stepped across him and went to the roundup where his horse went and jumped off the edge of that bull. Okay, there ought to be some cheering and screaming and everybody going. Nobody said anything. I went back by Dad and I told him, I said, hey, I got to get out of here. If that don't impress people, somebody's going to get hurt before I get out of this thing. But they had a guy that run that ranch down there by the name of Ed Durham. I can tell King Ranch stories today because they're all at the Six's horse sale, so there won't be any of them here. A guy named Ed Durham run that ranch, and he was not much of a visitor, and he looked like he was about half mad to me all the time. And so I was being pretty careful around him, and he had a boy a little older than I was, and we'd got to be friends, and he and Dad had got to be friends. And he evidently had told his dad that I was a good hand, because when we got all the cutting done, Mr. Durham come by me, and he sat up in the pickup while Dad and them were doing all that, and he come by me and he said, I want you to come and back me up. And so I went in there, and he cut everything that, in his opinion, that they should have cut. And he would run, and I would be behind him. And if the cow turned, I'd be in the lead, and he'd be behind me. And he never said, good job, anything. And then, but as soon as we got everything cut, he turned to this hand and said something, and what it was is, bring him my good roping horse. Well, they had a great big herd, and it was all loose sand, and you didn't heel a calf like we grew up doing, you necked them. And when you necked them, it's like roping a deer. They just bounded like that the whole time. And the little old rope wasn't any bigger than your little finger, and it was about 40 feet long. I don't know how they could even throw it that far, but he wanted me to go in and rope calves with him. Well, I'd never done this before, and I figured out pretty quick if I just went like I was going to rope a calf in the arena, I was going to scatter the herd. So I kind of watched them. They just rode along there, and they just throw that loop, and it would just peel the calf's ears back when it went on his head. So I watched that a little bit, and I thought, okay, I'm ready. I finally swung that loop, and I threw it backwards. That little calf took a step back, and his mother took a step forward, and that rope went right square around her neck. And like I said, this guy looked like he was already in a bad mood, and I wasn't going to tell him what I had done. It was real, real dusty. So I just figured, as many cows there was in here, and as young as I am, so as much time as I've got on my side, I'm going to just keep taking this rope up until I get her so broke, she'll let me reach down and pull that rope off of her. I got real close about 4 or 5 times. And directly, I got too close to the edge. I'd kind of lost perspective where I was. Every time I got where they could see me, I would turn and get back into the dust in the middle of those cows. Well, I got too close to the edge and they saw me, and this guy hollered, "Cow roped." Well, when they said that, there was about 5 of them guys just hit that herd doing 100 miles an hour, and they roped everything on that cow that was wiggling, and she was stretched in every direction. They took the rope off of her, and they patted each other on the back, and they went back to their positions. So I told Mr. Durham, said, keep on roping. And I said, no, I'll tell you what, I'll just sit here and just hold the herd a little bit. He just turned around and roped the cow right square around the neck, and he said, cow rope, and here they come. So I figured when I got back home that all these guys that I thought was wild men, they wasn't going to make it in South Texas either.
Fantastic.
Let's go down to the far end, a guy that I had the pleasure of introducing here a couple of years back. Billy Green, what do you got for us, Billy?
Well, it's a pretty hard bunch to follow. But talking about heroes, I'm going to address Shannon. I know Shannon. I wish I'd have been able to spend more time with him. But I've really gotten to know him through 2 of my heroes. The first one was Randy Rollins. And Shannon could tell you some good stories, but Randy's one of the finest horsemen I've ever been around. And he was responsible for some of my very best horses. And the second one is Greg Welch. Greg trained some of my horses, and I was asking Greg one day about turning back in cuttings and helping. And he said, watch Shannon Hall. And that's all he told me. And he also told me, he said, Shannon is the best at studying and knowing which cattle to cut. He said, I listen to him more than anyone else. But he loved you, Shannon. And then the hero I had from New Mexico, he grew up in Albany. He was the same age as White Matthews. They were both born in 1899. His name was Jack Payne. I don't know if y'all knew Jack, but he spent most of his life in northern New Mexico, I think. And Jack was quite a cowboy and a great man, too. One of the best men I ever knew. But he spent 40, 50 years out there in New Mexico. He worked for a man named Mr. Jones, and I think it was up around Eagle Nest. But he moved back to Albany in the 70s, and I got to know him real well. But I asked Jack one day why he left New Mexico. And he said, well, he said it was early fall, and he had to gather some strays that hadn't come out of the mountains yet. And he took a couple of horses, and I tell you, he had a little brown horse that he kept there at his house in Albany. And he kept that little horse. He didn't ride him that much, but he kept him fat. And that little horse never lacked anything. And but he said he rode that little horse one day and took pack mules and went up into the mountains to gather those last strays. And a blizzard blew in. And I think this was probably in October. But he says the worst one he'd ever seen. And he said his face froze. And his eyes froze shut. He couldn't see where he was going. And he said that little brown horse got him home. And his wife took some warm rags and thawed his face out. And he still had a kind of a scalded face. But he said that little brown horse was never going to lack for anything. And one thing more about Jack, he never went to church, but I can remember going to see him, and on his table in his living room was the most worn out Bible I've ever seen. And that defined Jack Pate, who was another one of my heroes. But I don't know how y'all do it in New Mexico. You're tougher than me.
Well, how about a nice round of applause for all these guys up here real quick. Again, we want to remind everyone that if you've got friends out there and want to see the induction a little later on, be sure and tell them to tune into the World Wide Web. AV Workshop is down here in front, and they're taking care of that for us, and they always do a wonderful job in doing that. And with your permission, real quick, before we go to the chuck wagon, if I could ask everybody to remove cover for just a moment, and we'll go to the Lord. Our gracious Heavenly Father, Lord, we just thank you so much for these men that have blazed the trail for us, the ranching way of life. And Lord, we thank you for our livestock, for without good livestock, we couldn't be the cowboys that we are today. We ask that you bless this food to the nourishment of our body. We ask that you bless the ones that prepared it for us. And we ask for a safe trip for everyone that is going home tonight. We ask all these things in your blessed and holy name. Amen.
Now we come to the highlight of the evening. It's been a great day. I've really been proud of what we heard and thankful for what we heard. This is just one of the highlights of my year every year is having you people show back up. It's become a reunion of hats, as I call it, and I like that. It's fun. That's what we're all about. One of the things that you need to understand about what we do here, if you're not totally aware of what we do, Ernest, can you please be quiet? Ernest. Gail, tell Ernest to be quiet. I can hear him up here, and I'll hear him on tape if he doesn't be quiet. Thank you. One of the things that we do here that people may not realize is we are still a collecting institution in regards to archival material. And we've been fortunate enough this year to have a gift to the library that's just been received, and it's archival collections regarding the horse cavalry. And it's a fairly extensive collection that involves Fort Riley, Kansas. So I'm going to introduce Joe Sullivan, our trustee from Wiley, Texas, North Dallas County, and he's going to talk to us just a second, and then he's going to introduce the donor to you. Thank you.
Just a second, he said, and I take that as a direct order. I'm surprised he trusts me up here. I am actually the newest trustee here. I only signed on to this outfit in 1996, as close as we can find out. But before I talk about Philip Sauerland, oh, there he is. I tell you, that's what we're talking about with the stability of the Haley. We do have a very stable organization. We have an organization that's in the black. We have an organization that takes absolutely no money from any governmental entity whatsoever. And so crazy things can happen. I mean, you could have an Irishman pretending to be Hispanic get elected to office and it wouldn't even affect us. Now, that said, the library, even though these things we're doing are wonderful, and we're taping these things and we're keeping these things in perpetuity, the library has a very focused, very important collection which contains things that aren't anywhere else. So really, if you're researching the cattle industry, the westward expansion, this should be a starting point, not a waypoint in that kind of research. So a great deal of historical work comes out of this library. Now, the military expansion and the role and the interaction of the military with the westward settlement, and especially with the cattle industry, has always been part of our mission. I don't need to tell you all the remount service, the developments in farrier science, the developments in veterinary science, and the fact that a lot of families were very glad to sell beef and horse flesh to the Army from time to time to make it through the winter. Our collection in that area is not as strong as some of our other collections, but that is changing. Philip Sauerland, my friend here from Pennsylvania, and I have been collecting this stuff for years. And Philip just sent down many, many boxes that I'll let him tell you about that pertain specifically to Fort Riley, which was the cavalry school. I don't think the Army has quite as good a collection as Philip does, or if they do, they don't know where it all is. I can attest to how rare some of this stuff is because Philip beat me in bidding for some of it, and I've never been able to find it anywhere else. Philip and I met close to 20 years ago. We met in an online cavalry forum. We've met many times since, and I was very, very pleased when he was looking for a place to put his materials and agreed to put it with us. Just as a side point, one of our little meetings, we always have a memento. This tie is a lost wax casting in sterling of the model 1909 cavalry bridle rosette, and we gave that out as a memento. Phil is going to tell you a little bit about this new portion that's just come into the library, and I can assure you some others of us collectors are going to be adding to it. Phil?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, what I've given to the museum is a collection of material from the horsemanship program at Fort Riley, Kansas. Now, there have been a number of books written about that very momentous period when they were converting from horses to machines between the two world wars. Very little has been looked at with what we're doing with the horsemanship program. The horsemanship program was very important. Subsequently, essentially, the Army developed the way that the Americans ride their horses in the horse shows. All of the little girls and men and boys in the Olympics, they ride based on what was developed at Fort Riley. And what I've got and what I've donated is material related to this. It includes horse show programs, includes 16mm movies, includes training manuals, includes some very interesting school manuals, kind of like high school annuals for the school, which was called the RASP. So it's a lot of very interesting material that's quite different, the things you wouldn't even think about. This is Fort Riley, Kansas. They were dressing up as in red scarlet coats and going off hunting coyotes as if they were Englishmen doing fox hunting. And now there was a purpose to this. What they wanted was to train the officers in riding cross country. It turned out that almost all the officers had ridden on trails. They'd never ridden cross country. So it was kind of a fun way to do it. And they would have polo, they would have rodeos, they had all different activities. And then subsequently, and there's some material that Joe and I were kind of interested in, during World War II, at the very beginning of World War II, they thought the cavalry, horse cavalry, was going to have an important part. So a lot of very famous people, Paul Mellon, for instance, came to Fort Riley to be horse cavalrymen. Well, that didn't work out, of course. And they were mechanized, though oddly enough, at the end of the war, they were kind of reactivated a little bit because it turned out they did need them in Italy. And perhaps they were even thinking they might need them in Japan. So anyway, Joe offered the opportunity to put this in the museum here. It looked like an excellent opportunity to keep everything together, and I'm very pleased to have done that. Thank you.
Okay. There are quite a few of you here who knew of Foy Proctor. There are probably quite a few of you here that didn't know who he was or what he had done. So I'm going to take just a minute or two, and I'm going to run through a little quick PowerPoint that shows you, just scratches the surface of who Foy Proctor was. And I think you'll have a better appreciation for him if you're not already aware who he was. I say right. That's Foy Proctor in his later years. He died in 1988. He was born in 1896. He was the cowman's cowman. It's that simple. That's what he looked like when he entered this world in 1898, after he entered the world in 86. Those are his parents. He was raised in Runnels County, Texas, L.C. and Rita Proctor. This is what he was when he just in his high school year, senior in high school. He went off to World War I with his brother, who's not in this picture. That with him is Sergeant E.L. May. How many of you have ever heard of Harley May? Harley May was a paint horse trainer. That was E.L. was Harley's daddy. He married Hal Mitchell Proctor in I don't remember now what it was, 1930 something, 28 or 30. And they had no children, but they were partners in everything that they did in the ranching world. He had ranches in Midland, Texas, all the way from northwest of Midland to near Andrews, called the Chicago or the Sea Ranch. It was 200 sections. It was a David Faskin ranch, which when it was started was 300 plus sections. The Maybes bought the east half, and David Faskin bought the west half, and Foy Proctor had it for many, many years. He also had ranches at Channing, Texas, part of the old XIT in the Matador. He had a ranch at Wilcox, Arizona. He had, did I mention Magdalena? Anyway, this is the Three Links Ranch, and that's Rex Allen on the ground with his boot out holding that calf down, and Foy's holding tight with him. They used to have fun with their stuff. As old as they got, they still had fun. He was a big supporter of community efforts. He would lead the rodeo parades. He was chairman of the Midland Rodeo. It was an all-around world championship rodeo back in the 40s. Three Links picture there, life in the old way. He was also kind of frugal about the way he ran his ranches. If it didn't have to be spent, they didn't spend it. You can see the wooden pins. This was before pipe was prevalent. Hereford cattle. It's what made the southwestern ranches. White-faced Herefords. And he knew how to pick the best ones. He was a trader extraordinaire. Not only did he raise the good ones, he bought and sold good ones. There were years that he sold between 15 and 50,000 head a year that he had collected on all the ranges of southwestern Texas and southeastern New Mexico. Here he's got his banking board from the First National Bank of Midland up at Channing. John Butler, Harvey Hurd, a bunch of those old Midland people. He was a community builder. They're breaking ground here for the Midland Memorial Hospital. There's the bank board building. First National Bank was the first billion-dollar bank, near billion-dollar bank in the United States. It failed in 1983. On the left, you see Junior Hayes, his longtime ranch manager at Channing Ranch. And on the right, you see Melvin Cotton, horseback with Mr. Proctor on the C Ranch. Is Kathleen still here? Kathleen Hayes still here? She must have left. Kathleen Hayes, Junior Hayes' daughter, was here earlier today. There's Beth in the middle with Foy and Junior. This was a birthday party in Midland. There's Junior and Melvin below. And I'm not sure who those people are on the right. Bill Joel might know who they are. He tried Brangus cattle. He was one of the first to bring Angus and Bramer Cross into West Texas. This was about the prime of his life when he was moving and shaking. There he is in his later years, and you can see the improvements with the pipe pins. A quote from Clarence Scarver Jr., Foy Proctor has forgotten more about the cow business than most of us will ever know. Tom Lineberry, who was well known as one of the cow people that broke the ice with the oil and gas industry and quite literally made a lot of them very unhappy. Foy Proctor was the best judge of a man, a cow, and a horse that I have ever known. That's it. Now you know a little bit about Foy Proctor. I'm going to turn this microphone over to Terry Jordan. You're up.
Thank you, Pat. How's everybody doing on a Saturday night, huh? Y'all in a good mood? Yeah, we had a nice rain, and it's going to be a nice evening for all of us. And, we're streaming live on the World Wide Web, so thank those people for joining us as well. And I'd like to ask real quick if you have served in our military, our police, or first responders, firefighter. If you would stand up, we would like to pay our respect to you guys. Over here, thank you, thank you. Tonight, we're very honored to present two very special people to you, Warren Davis and Shannon Hall, and they are honorary recipients. This makes the 19th year for us to do this here at the Haley Library, and I'm going to touch on a couple of things real quick that Pat didn't. And for a lot of you that are not familiar with the Haley, this is the #1 ranch research library anywhere in the United States. They get calls weekly from people like the Discovery Channel, anybody that is trying to do research on any type of ranch. This is the place that they call. And if you go over there, you'll see the original Alamo Mission Bell. They've got some Russells and some Remingtons and some just really neat stuff over there. And so it is really a diamond that we're fortunate to have here in Midland, Texas. I'd like to thank Pat and the Board of Regents, Board of Directors for inviting me back. It's always an honor to be here, and I thank them for that. So without further ado, I'd like to talk to you for just a moment about a couple of guys. The Davis family of New Mexico continues to run a ranch that was started by today's manager's great-grandfather. When Frank Springer topped a rise and looked down on the little village of Cimarron, New Mexico, in February of 1873, two things struck him: is the snow-covered peaks to the west and the rolling short grass prairies to the east. It was a beautiful sight for a young man who had come from Iowa. He'd come west the year before as a lawyer for the Maxwell Land Grant. Living in Las Vegas, New Mexico, he'd ridden north to Cimarron to take care of some company business and immediately fell in love with the country. As a matter of fact, Springer was so struck with the area that same afternoon he bought 1,000 acres 6 miles east of Cimarron on some of the prettiest pastured land he had ever seen. That first 1,000 acres became the basis for 18,000 acres of the CS Cattle Company. In 2000, they earned the Best Remuda Award presented by the AQHA and the Bayer Corporation to the ranch that is judged to have the best remuda. Warren Mitchell Davis, the son of James Leslie Davis and Linda Mitchell Davis. Warren was born into Les and Linda on July 28, 1954 in Raton, New Mexico. Warren is the oldest of 6 children born to Les and Linda, and he's the 4th generation to be on the family ranch. All of his siblings are involved in the ranching as well, and some of the 5th generation are actively involved in the ranch as well. Warren has great memories of riding horses behind cattle all of his life. He feels blessed to have been able to spend most of his time in the great outdoors. Ranch life's not always easy, but he remembers taking the cattle on long drives up into the mountain country. The day began long before the sun was visible, and the drive was often dusty. Once the cattle were at the foot of the mountain, they rested in the trap until later that afternoon when the gate would be opened into the drift pasture. The older cows would be ready to start up, but the younger cows would have to be pushed up the next morning. Warren and some of his siblings, along with Jiggs Porter and other cowboys, would spend the night at the camp. The crew played cards and slept in cowboy bedrolls. After the cows and calves were up on the mountain country, the Davis crew would later make a trip into the Martinez camp high in the mountains to brand the remnant calves. Later in the fall, the cows and calves would have to make that drive back to the CS headquarters. Warren recalls that branding's always been his favorite time during the seasonal work on the ranch. He loves to rope and drag calves, and when he was a youngster flanking calves with his family and friends, made great memories. Warren loved the camaraderie of cowboying with a good crew, and he attended school in Cimarron from kindergarten until the 11th grade, where he's enrolled in the New Mexico Military Institute. He remembers leaving home and being one of the hardest things he ever had to do, but feels the education and discipline he learned at New Mexico Military Institute was invaluable. After high school graduation in 1972, Warren attended New Mexico State University, earning a degree in animal science and graduating in 1977. He missed one semester when his father Les had suffered a heart attack. In 1979, Warren met his future wife, Mary Ola Bailey of Waynesboro, Georgia. Mary's parents, J.W. and Betty Bailey, raised horses on their family ranch, the Windy Hill Ranch. They were the oldest breeders of quarter horses in the state of Georgia. The Baileys made trips to Raton and Cimarron, New Mexico to buy horses, and on one of those trips, Warren met Mary, and they were married a year later on November 29th, 1980. Mary says his love at first sight. Warren said it took him just a little bit longer. Mary joined Warren in working on the ranch. She's been involved in all aspects of the ranch, especially managing the breeding along with breaking and training. On March 12, 1984, Warren and Mary had their first child, a son, Walter Leslie Davis. Sarah Elizabeth Davis was born October 24, 1985, and Walter and Sarah were homeschooled until high school. This enabled them to be involved with everyday ranch life, and both the kids made top hands. Warren has done his best to instill in his children a love for the family ranch. He feels the responsibility to pass this ranch safely into the hands of the next generation. The drought began in early 2000 has been a great challenge, and one of the hardest times he remembers was when he had to send cows to manage that he managed at the Crow Creek Division to Colorado and Wyoming. Because of the stress on the pastures and the lack of water, he is faced with sending them away or selling them. Mary believes that Warren's courage in making this choice may have well preserved the CS Cattle Company. The CS did not have to lose a single employee, even though the ranch was paying someone else to care for the cattle. Warren was able to bring those cows home in a year, and And when he sold them, he would have had to sell them at a cheaper price and buying cows back at a higher price. Warren says that he hopes that he honors those who've gone on before him in making the ranch successful. He believes that the future way of life is tough and you have to love it. It isn't a 9-to-5 job with the convenience of town close by. He feels that stewardship of the land and preservation of ranch life is of utmost importance. Life and death are realities of the life he lives. Life is so precious. The joy of seeing a newborn calf being licked clean by its mama is hard to describe. People who live in town just don't see that. Warren has told his kids that ranch life cycle is like a big merry-go-round. Each year you do the same thing. Calve in March and April, brand in May. Wean and ship in October and November, and the year changes and it all begins again. Same things are going on now that were going on over the past 145 years. There have been some changes for sure, but for the most part, it's the same, only a different group doing it. Once you've had your ride on the go-round and get off, others will take your place and keep the ranch going. The CS Cattle Company has horses that are used daily throughout the year. The ranch is a breeder of quarter horses for over 60 consecutive years. Our broodmare band ranges from 35 mares in 1980 down to 25 mares in 1990 and as low as 5 mares during the worst drought year of 2000. This year in 2018, they bred 10 mares. The ranch could not function as it does today without the use of the horses. The CS believes that a good ranch horse must be sound, with good feet and legs, deep in the heart girth, topped off with a prominent wither. A good ranch horse is cowy, athletic, quick-footed, and dependable. They've made it a priority to have intelligent, kind horses that are also good-looking. They brand their calves the old-fashioned way. They drag them to the fire. During the fall, they sort the pairs on horseback. During weaning, they use the horses to doctor and load the sick cattle. The CS produces premium all-around ranch horses, cavalry mounts, hunter jumpers, and polo ponies, and have been part of the thoroughbred racing in New Mexico since the 1930s. The CS Cattle Company has been a family ranch from the very beginning when Frank Springer brought his brother Charles out to manage things. It's still family run, and it's still the same family. Frank would have been proud. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our 2018 Foy Proctor Cowman's Award, honor of recipient, Mr. Warren Davis. Warren, on behalf of the trustees and the staff of the Haley Library, receive the Foy Proctor. Thank you. This is truly an honor. I appreciate it. He's going to get a picture.
Well, gosh, this is truly an honor. When I received the letter, I had to look at the envelope three times to make sure it was addressed to me because I didn't think they could find somebody up in Maxwell, New Mexico to win this thing. And so I'm really humbled and honored to be selected for this award, and it's deeply appreciated, I can assure you. I've got quite a crew here that I want to introduce, but first of all, I don't know, I married over my head. I don't know how the Lord blessed me so much, but anyway, I married over my head, and as the story goes, that was kind of the gist of it, but she showed up. I didn't have to leave Colfax County. People didn't think I'd go anywhere, so they wondered how a Georgia girl got to the Colfax County, and it was, I kind of got to do a little explaining. She actually came to Colfax County and found me. I didn't leave, and so we were driving down my mother and I and this classmate of my sister's was driving down the road towards Crow Creek, and out was coming this motorhome, and we couldn't figure out who had a motorhome, and so we stopped and visited and met Mary and her folks and visited, and then later they called Jiggs, who I'll refer to Jiggs quite a bit. He was my mentor, and I don't know, he kind of courted Mary for me, I guess you could put it, is how it started. But anyway, they invited us over to eat barbecue chicken, and so we got a taste of Southern barbecue that night. And then Jiggs invited Mary back to work. We were wrapping up the fall work, so he invited her back to ride with us, and so she rode with us the next day, and got to ride in the bobtail truck. And it seemed we were in the truck for a couple days. We had to go different places, and I was always right behind the steering wheel next to the door pretty tight, and seemed like she kept moving towards me, and I think the door probably had an indentation of my arm as I kept trying to get further away, and I didn't want anybody to see me with a girl in the front of a bobtail when we're supposed to be working. And so anyway, Jiggs invited her back to visit in January, and then I went to visit her for a week in March. She came back, and by then we kind of talked some, and I said, well, if you come back in May, and what she said, we have to bring that stud back. I said, well, we'll try to schedule a couple brandings while you're here. Well, she liked that idea, and I said, and you can rope. Well, she'd never roped before, so that week while we were in Georgia, we had a roping clinic. We found a couple ropes and a sawhorse, and we practiced throwing traps for a week, and then we got her horse back, and I showed her the various angles to throw the trap with. And so, long story short, when she got here, she was pretty adept at roping, and she blended right in and has done so ever since. But anyway, then I went back again she came in July again, then I went back in September, and we were married in November. So if you added the days up, we probably saw each other about 6 weeks the whole time. And I actually wrote a few letters. I don't know. That was back before emails, and so I had to really make my words big to make it look like I was writing a long letter of 2 or 3 pages, but you could probably make it into 1 page if I shortened it up. But so anyway, she's the best thing that ever happened to me then. And you're looking back on it, you can see how the Lord had his hand in everything on that. I mean, like I say, there's no way I'd have run into her, and if we'd have been 5 minutes later, they'd have probably been out of the driveway, and we'd have never met. And so it all worked out for the best. And anyway, she's the top hand on the place, and does the horses, and I wouldn't be up here without her. So Mary, would you please stand up? All right, my 2 kids are Walter and his wife Amy. Then my daughter Sarah and her husband Jim Sorrell. Now I'll start with my sister Julia and her husband David Stafford. They're here. She fits right in between Randy and I. Then my brother Randy, what you met earlier up here. Sometimes I wish you hadn't have met him. He probably told too much, but anyway, he's our ambassador and goodwill man, the hunter, cowpuncher. He just does a little everything. And so, and his sons, Ryan is here. Where is he? And his son, his son, Rhett, and his daughter, Ada Kate, they're here. And his son, Chris. All right, they're here. Then I've got a niece that's from Kim's daughter, Leslie, and her husband, Brandon Blakeney. They live at the headquarters, and he runs the headquarters part of the cattle operation. And they're a blessing to the ranch. And she's working on the 6th generation as we speak right now. And so... And then I got Mary's niece, Leslie and her husband Chad and her daughter Bailey Figueredo. They're here also. They live in Fort Worth. And so we've got quite a crew here representing us. And I'd like to go a little bit into what I would call the lifers that came before me, and this is just during my lifetime, and I guess at the top of that list, I'd have to put my parents. When we got home from school, college, I should say, even before that, we had 4-H calves, and we had responsibility, but once we got back from college, they turned a lot of the ranch over to us, and we were just kids, so to speak, but they saddled us with responsibility and that, and looking back on it, it was good. It was a lot to shoulder at the time, we thought, but I think that helped us to develop in that. And another lifer that I've referred to already is Jiggs Porter. He was the cow boss there at Crow Creek and raised all of us kids, but us boys would go over there and stay with him in the summers, and he'd come and get us before that, like Randy said, take him cutting horses and that. And so without Jiggs, we probably wouldn't have had near the horse skills, cattle skills that we were able to glean on to. Caleb Wheatley was another one. He was what I would call a ranch engineer. Anything water, pipeline, anything mechanic-wise, he could do that. And my brother Kirk followed him around a lot. And now he can take a dozer apart and put it back together and not have any pieces left over, and which I wouldn't even know where to start to do that. And so he learned a lot of those skills from Caleb. And he was another one that, these lifers, as I call them, they were with us their whole lifetime, I think, and it was just what we've talked about today, the way of life, and it's not for the dollar, but it's just the way of life that they enjoyed. And another one was John Gonzalez that worked for us forever, it seemed like. And another story on Jiggs is he came to work for the CS, he said I think it was 35, I think. He was 16 years old, and other than when he went and worked for Mr. Roosevelt, he called him, for 4 years, he drew a check from the CS for probably 65 years, and he was a true CS man. And that's what my dad would refer to, a lot of people that were just heart and soul in the ranch. And today we've got some more, the non-family. There's 2 fellas that work with me that have been there almost since I've been there. They've been there 40 plus years. Luis Lopez and Javier Chavez. Gail McBrayer is another one that's been with us 35 plus years. And so it gets back to what, I don't know if it was Ken saying it or what, but about his employees, where they know what to do and they do it, and you just, you appreciate employees like that you don't have to be looking over their shoulder all the time. And so we're blessed. We're down to, when I was a kid, it seemed like hands everywhere, and there was a lot of employees, and we're down to now with just 4 hired employees, and the rest of them are family members that pitch in and do all the work. So we're kind of it's all a hands-on deal, and we're just keeping grinding and getting after it. And I don't know if any of you heard of Dale Brisby, but we're just ranching. That's what we're doing. We're getting after it. So I'm humbled and honored to receive this award. When I see the names of the past recipients, I tell myself there's no way that I'm there. I'm not one of them, but I appreciate the continuing the Western lifestyle and the way of life, and I just can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Shannon Hall was born to parents Donnie and Sandy Paul Hall in 1964 in Amarillo, Texas. His father was born in Cook County, Texas in 1941 in a house in a cotton patch. Grandfather George Hall worked on ranches around Goodnight and Clarendon. Shannon's mother was born in Knox City, Texas in 1943. Her family farmed and ranched on his Uncle Bud Roberts in and around Tulia. His mother and dad met in a grocery store in Wayside, Texas, when Donnie was working on the JAs in 1959. His dad worked for the W.J. Lewis estate on the Oral Ranch in Briscoe and Donley counties, where he retired in 1999, and his mother now lives with Shannon and Rhonda on their ranch. Shannon is now third generation in the family, earning a living horseback and chasing cows. Shannon's worked for the RO, the Cash, the 4.6s, the Barbie, the Spade, the Babbitt, and has been self-employed since 1988. His fondest memories go back to the age of 11 when the family moved to the W.J. Lewis estate. He said every day was an experience working with his dad and the crew. One of the best lessons learned was on his first paid job at the ranch at the age of 12, when he was tasked by cattle buyer Douglas Shelton to keep a set of Lewis calves off of water till they were weighed. He fell asleep. He never forgot the disappointment in himself and letting the others down when he did not do his job. Shannon has one full brother, Buddy, a judge in New Mexico, a half-brother, Shane, a horse trainer in Weatherford, and Tim, a police detective in Pittsburgh. Shannon met the love of his life, Rhonda Lynn Blunt, while working in Kansas riding horses, and she was working in a restaurant. They were married in 1991. Rhonda's family ranches on country in southwest Kansas and northwest Oklahoma has been in their family since the 1800s. Rhonda and Shannon have 3 children, Whitney Nicole, Katie Bell, and Dakota Joe. Whitney's a partner on the ranch. Katie Bell's in college, and Dakota Joe's in the 8th grade. They all make hands when work's to be done, but Whitney takes care of the cow herd. His greatest hope is for his children to intimately know God, be happy in their life choices, and continue the ranch working. Like all of us, his greatest fear of nature is drought and fires. He believes that his fear of the Lord God is the beginning of wisdom as spoken in Psalms 111, verse 10. Shannon believes the greatest pleasure in life from his work comes from being able to saddle his horse, see the sun rise, and enjoy God's creation, and simply being a cowboy. The family does everything horseback on the high-maintenance country where the cattle have to be checked regularly, roped and doctored horseback, and they ride for fun. The kids show in cutting, reining, cow horse, roping, barrel racing. It's just what they do. Well, he did it well, too. He became associated with a former Proctor Award recipient, Billy Cogdell of Tulia, Texas, and took the horse Shania C to the 1999 National Cutting Horse Maturity and won it with a 225.5 and made the cutting world take notice. He is now only riding horses for family and close friends. No, by the way, he won a little over $3 million in his cutting career and is in the NCHA Hall of Fame. And he gives back. He's conducted free clinics for the 4-H Club in Paducah, Texas, and a clinic in the Chicago area for wounded veterans. And every once in a while he gives walk, trot, and lope lessons. When asked about his favorite horse, he can recall that he said, "That's a hard question." He tells us that he's been blessed with several great horses. Skip was my best all-around horse, he says. He was a super horse to work a roundup, a rope on, and he's a big, strong horse. His current favorite horse is named Lucky Ned Pepper. He says, "We raised him and named him after the outlaw and true grit portrayed by Robert Duvall, not knowing he'd live up to his namesake." As a 2-year-old, he bucked off his horse breaker, and then his cow had, and that horse was scared to death of everyone. Said he rode him for 2 weeks and had to leave for a lengthy horse show, so he sent him to a friend that's a great an NFR bronc rider. Old Ned got him twice, and he said, "I brought him home, decided we must be friends." 1 year later, he won over $30,000 cutting and is his buddy. A super athlete, extremely smart. He says his daughter Whitney shows him, and Lucky Ned Pepper is his favorite. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our 2018 Floyd Proctor Cummins Award honor recipient, Mr. Shannon Hall.
Shannon, on behalf of the trustees, the Hayward Library, and staff, we present you with Foy Proctor Cattlemen's Award of Honor.
Thank you, sir.
Can we get a picture, Pat?
Wow. That's all I can say at this moment. Obviously, I have the greatest family. Yours is second greatest. I'm sorry, Warren. The greatest family that God ever gave anyone. I'm thankful for my wife, Rhonda, my 3 beautiful daughters that all work hard at pleasing Dad, the greatest mother in the world that raised me when life was hard, the greatest father in the world that taught me a profession that no one can compare to nothing on earth. You know, I love that song that Buster loves, and it talks about a cattleman being the king. This is the occupation of a king that we get to share. And I'm thankful that my dad taught me that and taught me to do it with a love and a passion. I have the greatest stepmother in the world that loved me like I was her own. And I just thank God they didn't get her up on this stage today telling stories. You know, when I considered this award, I looked through that list of past recipients. Well, first Buster called me and he said, I think there's a chance you're going to get this award. And then I believe it was Dawson I talked to that congratulated me. And I told him, I said, do they know I'm from Oklahoma? And he said, well, I'm not sure anybody told them yet. And I said, okay. But I looked through that list of past recipients, and I was so humbled because there's so many men on that list that I either worked for or I worked with, men that I watched with awe and with respect, men that when I worked for them treated me like an honest man, and they were good to me, gave me opportunities in life that I would have not had without them, men that I watched cowboying when I watched John Scott grab a horse by the tail in the bottom of a canyon at 70-something years old and drag him out the top. And I thought, man, that's a cowboy. I remember when I was young, my dad had boxes of Western Horseman magazines. And I often thought I'd go through and I'd look at those magazines and look at the men on the covers. And I often thought if I could ever get my picture on the cover of Western Horseman magazine. Well, I achieved that a few years ago, and I promise you, I didn't feel like I feel tonight standing in front of these true cattlemen and true horsemen. I'm humbled. When I read that list and I consider those men, I don't know that I can be in their league as a horseman or a cattleman. But as I studied it and I thought about Foy Proctor, all I know about Foy Proctor is what my friend Buster Welch has told me. I didn't grow up in this area, and so my education of Foy Proctor was from Buster or from this video. But I knew I had a very dear friend, a gentleman named Punch Skelton, who's a good cowboy, was a really good cowboy, and now, in my opinion, is the best bootmaker in the state of Texas. He builds my boots now, and I knew that Punch had worked for Mr. Proctor on the ranch in Channing. So I called Punch and I said, I want to know more about Foy Proctor. It's such an honor to receive this award, and I know many of the recipients, but I want to know what it is that makes me available to achieve and receive this award, because I want to know more about Foy Proctor. And he told me that he was a good horseman. He told me he was an incredible cattleman. He said, you know, one of Punch's favorite stories about Foy Proctor was he said they had cattle there on the ranch in Channing, and they got lepto in those cattle. And he said they were horned Herefords and they had to vaccinate them 7 times. He said the first time wasn't too difficult, but he said those old cattle were wild, and he said by that 5th or 6th time, they were tired of being gathered, they were tired of being stripped, and they were really tired of being vaccinated. And he said Foy always sorted those cattle at the gate himself, afoot. And he said those old wild cattle, Punch said I wouldn't even get off afoot with them. And if I did and they looked at me, I ran to the fence. And he said Foy stood in that gate with a gunny sack, and he folded it in half, and he stripped those old cows and calves off afoot with that gunny sack. And he said about every 3rd cow would go by, and every cowboy would duck their head thinking this one's got him. And said Foy just stood his ground and stripped them and never missed a one. He said he was certainly a true cattleman. But what he told me about Foy Proctor that humbled me so much was when he told me about the man. And he told me how he treated his employees, and he told me a great story that many of you may know, but it just was so inspiring to me. He told me about Mr. Proctor having Junior Hayes running the ranch there in Channing. And he said he had a bunch of horses that he wanted to sell. I believe they came from the Sea Ranch here, and they took them to Channing, if my story's correct. And he gave him all these horses, and he told him, he said, Junior, here's the deal. I want $500 a head for these horses. You sell them. Whatever you make over these horses is yours. You keep it. He said $500 in the 60s was a lot of money at the time for a good horse. But he said they were sure enough good horses. And he said Mr. Hayes worked hard at it, and he sold all of those horses for more than what he owed Mr. Proctor for. And so he said when they settled up, Mr. Proctor not only paid him all the money that was made over the $500, but he said he later came to his wife and he said, you know, Junior did me a great job with those horses, and he could not have done it without you. I want you to go to town, and he said, I want you to buy whatever furniture you want and refurnish this house. And he said, don't go buy cheap furniture. Go buy the best stuff there is. And he said she did that. And when I learned that, I thought, God help me to be that appreciative a person of the people that have made me what I am today. I had employees, like I mentioned, Frank Kelton today. That boy worked hard. That man worked hard. But he's an integral part of who Shannon Hall is today. This wonderful family that I have sitting down here is a huge part of who I am today. I've got many friends here, Buster, Mark Gardner, Jay Hurt. That list goes on. Jig's man was the first person to ever pay me for punching cows. He paid me $15 for a full day's work, and I thought, man, this is the life of a king right here, $15 a day. I did what I love to do all day long. As I studied that and I learned more about Mr. Proctor, I realized as Shannon Hall, I'll never be the horseman or the cattleman that he was or most of those recipients are. But if I continue to work hard and I strive to be a godly, good, fair person and appreciate those around me that lift me up, maybe I can be the kind of man he was. Thank you so very much for this award. It means the world to me.
Great job, guys. Again, thank each and every one of you for coming out on a Saturday night to spend a little bit of time with us. And the guys that told stories today, thank you. Some wonderful stories that we had up here. I'd ask you to do me a favor, though. When you go back home, tell somebody about the Haley Library. Come back next year and bring somebody with you, because this is something that they will not want to miss. I'm going to leave you with one last closing statement. It doesn't matter how long you live. What matters is how you live. I'm Terry Jordan. Thank you for having me. Good night, everyone.